Welcome, I am your host, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Thank you for joining me on another story. Today, we are talking about a murder on a wedding day. Chapter 1. The Telegram. The September afternoon had settled into that peculiar London gloom, which seems to absorb all light and sound, leaving only the steady drip of rain against the windows of our Baker Street lodgings. I sat before the fire, attempting to focus on the latest issue of the Lancet, though my attention wandered repeatedly to my companion, who had spent the better part of 3 days in a state of restless melancholy that invariably preceded either a brilliant insight or an insufferable mood. Sherlock Holmes stood at the window, his aquiline profile silhouetted against the grey light, and one hand tucked behind his back while the other drew idle patterns in the condensation upon the glass. He had been thus for the past hour, having exhausted the morning papers, rejected 2 potential cases as trivial domestic matters beneath our consideration, and subjected Mrs. Hudson to a discourse on the deterioration of crime in modern London. "The criminal classes have grown disappointingly unimaginative, Watson," he remarked without turning. "Where once we had Napoleon of crime, we now have penny ante pickpockets and clumsy burglars who leave their calling cards at the scene. It is enough to make one consider retirement to the countryside to pursue the keeping of bees. Your bees would likely organise themselves into a criminal enterprise just to provide you with stimulation," I observed dryly. The ghost of a smile touched his lips, but before he could reply, the sound of rapid footsteps on the stairs drew his attention. Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door, slightly breathless, clutching a telegram. "Just arrived, Mr. Holmes. The boy said it was most urgent." Holmes crossed the room in 3 strides and took the telegram, his grey eyes scanning it with the intensity he reserved for promising puzzles. I watched his expression shift from mild interest to sharp attention. "Well, Watson, it appears the criminal classes have read my mind and conspired to provide entertainment. Fetch your coat and medical bag. We have a train to catch." He thrust the telegram into my hands. It was from Inspector Lestrade. "Bride murdered at wedding stop Blackwood Manor. Surrey stop. 200 witnesses. Stop attend immediately. Stop Lestrade." "Good heavens," I breathed. "Murdered at her own wedding?" "Too theatrical by half," Holmes replied, already shrugging into his travelling coat. "Likely a domestic poisoning with an obvious culprit that has somehow eluded our friend Lestrade's detection. Still, the venue is novel, and I confess the logistics intrigue me. How does one commit murder before 200 witnesses? Perhaps that is precisely why Lestrade requires your assistance. Perhaps," Holmes consulted his pocket watch, "the 3:47 to Guildford should serve us. Come, Watson, a bride lies dead, and somewhere among those 200 witnesses lurks either a murder of extraordinary audacity or the solution to what will prove a disappointingly mundane tragedy." Within the hour, we were settled in a first-class compartment as the train pulled away from Waterloo Station. Holmes had purchased the evening papers at the platform and now spread them across his lap with the systematic precision that characterised all his movements. "Ah, here we are," he murmured, pointing to a column in the Evening Standard. "Society wedding of the season. Miss Victoria Blackwood, daughter of the late Magistrate Harrison Blackwood, wed to Mr. James Hartley of Hartley Shipping. Or rather, she was to be wed. The ceremony concluded, but the bride collapsed during the wedding breakfast. Dead within the hour. Does it mention the cause? The family physician suspects poison, though the source remains unknown. Local inspector has sealed the estate." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he continued reading. Miss Blackwood was 28 years of age. Interesting. How so? "The late magistrate was a man of considerable wealth, Watson. I recall his name from several notable cases. He died 5 years ago, leaving his fortune in trust. The daughter has been under the guardianship of her elder brother since that time." He tapped the newspaper thoughtfully. 28 years old. Most trusts transfer to the beneficiary at 30, or upon marriage. You think the timing significant? Everything is significant until proven otherwise." Holmes produced a railway timetable from his pocket. When he had acquired it, I could not say, and began making notes in the margins. The wedding was at midday. The bride collapsed at approximately 2:30. Symptoms appeared suddenly, suggesting acute poisoning rather than gradual administration. That narrows the window considerably. Indeed, and complicates the matter of opportunity. With 200 guests present, how does one administer poison unobserved? He leaned back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. Unless, of course, the poison was administered before the witnesses arrived. But then why wait? Why allow the ceremony to proceed? I had no answer to offer, and Holmes lapsed into silence, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the rain-streaked window. I knew that expression well. His mind was already constructing and deconstructing theories, filing away facts, calculating probabilities. The Surrey countryside rolled past in shades of grey and green. As we neared Guildford, the rain lessened to a fine mist. Holmes consulted his watch once more. We should arrive at Blackwood Manor by 6:30. The light will be failing, which is unfortunate for examination of the grounds, but sufficient for initial observations. He turned to me with that peculiar intensity that always preceded his finest work. Tell me, Watson, what do you know of aconitine? The poison from wolfsbane, extremely toxic, acts on the nervous system, numbness, paralysis, cardiac arrest. Death can occur within hours of ingestion, sometimes less. Precise as ever, and the symptoms: tingling of the extremities, difficulty breathing, eventual cardiac failure. The victim remains conscious almost until the end, which makes it particularly cruel, a fact that may prove significant. Holmes gathered his papers and tucked them into his coat. This was no crime of passion, Watson. If poison was indeed the method, and aconitine specifically, then we are dealing with premeditation. Wolfsbane must be cultivated or acquired. The extract must be prepared. The opportunity must be created. He paused, his expression grave. Someone planned this murder with considerable care. The question is, who had both the means and the motive? The train began to slow as we approached our station. Through the window, I could see a police trap waiting on the platform, Lestrade's doing, no doubt. As we disembarked, a young constable hurried forward. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Inspector Lestrade sent me to collect you. The manor is 3 miles distant." The drive through the Surrey countryside revealed an estate of considerable grandeur approaching from neglect. The grounds showed signs of past elegance: ornamental gardens now slightly overgrown, a fountain in want of repair, statuary weathered by time. Blackwood Manor itself rose against the darkening sky, a Georgian structure of considerable size, its windows blazing with light despite the tragedy within. "Maintained staff preparing for celebration," Holmes observed, noting the lit windows, or attempting to maintain normalcy in the face of horror. Either way, illuminating. Inspector Lestrade met us at the entrance, his weathered face drawn with fatigue and frustration. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank heaven you've come. This business is beyond anything in my experience." "Compose yourself." "Lestrade," Holmes said briskly, striding into the entrance hall. "Give me the facts, if you please, and spare me the editorializing." The inspector consulted his notebook as we followed him through corridors still decorated with wilting orange blossoms and silk ribbons, a grotesque mockery of the day's intended joy. Miss Victoria Blackwood, aged 28, married this morning at 11 o'clock to Mr. James Hartley. Ceremony conducted in the family chapel, 200 guests in attendance. Wedding breakfast commenced at noon in the main ballroom. At approximately 2:30 p.m, during the dancing, Miss Blackwood, or rather Mrs. Hartley, complained of feeling unwell. She collapsed shortly thereafter in the portrait gallery. The family physician, Dr. Pemberton, was summoned immediately. She died at approximately 2:50, despite his efforts. The physician's diagnosis? Poison, Mr. Holmes. The symptoms were unmistakable. Dr. Pemberton has considerable experience in such matters. The local inspector sealed the estate immediately and sent for me. Most efficient. And have you formed any theories? Lestrade's expression turned uncomfortable. I've arrested the butler, Edward Price, on suspicion. He supervised all food and drink service, and it's come to light he's been embezzling from the wine cellar. Miss Blackwood discovered this and planned to dismiss him. And you believe he poisoned her champagne in revenge? Holmes's tone was carefully neutral, but I detected the scepticism beneath. With 200 witnesses observing the service, bold, if true. What else am I to think? He had motive, means, and opportunity. Perhaps. Or perhaps he is convenient. Holmes paused before a portrait in the hallway, a stern-faced man in judicial robes whom I took to be the late magistrate. Tell me, Lestrade, where is the brother, Geoffrey Blackwood, I believe? In the library. He's been, well, Devastated, as you might imagine. Barely coherent. "Indeed. We shall speak with him presently." Holmes turned to face us, his expression sharp in the gaslight. "Watson, I want you to examine the body. Lestrade, show me the death scene and preserve it exactly as found. No one is to enter that room until I've completed my examination." As we moved deeper into the house, past clusters of shocked guests and weeping servants, I felt the familiar thrill of the hunt begin. Somewhere in this grand house, among these 200 witnesses and wedding finery, lay the answer to an impossible crime, and if I knew Sherlock Holmes, he would not rest until every shadow had been illuminated and every secret exposed to the harsh light of truth. Chapter 2. The Bride's Last Hours. Inspector Lestrade led us through the manor's maze of corridors, past drawing rooms where guests still lingered in shocked clusters, their evening dress now seeming obscenely festive against the pall of death. Servants moved like ghosts through the halls, their faces pale and drawn. "I must speak with Geoffrey Blackwood first," Holmes announced, stopping before a door marked as the library. Lestrade's brow furrowed. "Mr. Holmes, surely the grieving brother should be left in peace." "Peace is a luxury we cannot afford when murder walks freely among us." Holmes's tone was sharp. "The brother was guardian to the deceased. He knows the family's secrets, the household's rhythms, and I particularly wish to hear his account of the wedding breakfast while events are fresh in his mind." The inspector knocked, and a hollow voice bade us enter. Geoffrey Blackwood sat slumped in a leather chair before a dying fire, a glass of brandy untouched on the table beside him. He was a man of perhaps 35, with the refined features common to good breeding but bearing the marks of recent dissolution. Shadows beneath red-rimmed eyes, a slight tremor in his hands, the pallor of sleepless nights that predated this tragedy. He rose unsteadily as we entered. "Inspector, is there news?" "Mr. Blackwood, this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, consulting detectives from London. They've come to assist in the investigation." "Holmes?" Geoffrey's eyes focused with difficulty. "The detective? Yes, I've read Watson's accounts. You solve impossible crimes." His voice broke. "Can you solve this one? Can you bring back my sister?" "I can bring her justice, Mr. Blackwood. That must suffice." Holmes moved closer, his gaze penetrating. "I know this is difficult, but I require your account of the events. Every detail, however insignificant it may seem." Geoffrey nodded, reaching for the brandy with a shaking hand. Holmes watched the gesture with interest. "Victoria was radiant this morning," Geoffrey began, his voice steadying as he fell into the rhythm of recollection. "The happiest I'd seen her in years. The ceremony was perfect. She spoke her vows clearly without hesitation. James seemed overcome. They both did. And after the ceremony, the wedding breakfast. Everyone moved to the ballroom, the tables were set, champagne flowing. Victoria was everywhere at once, speaking with guests, laughing. She loved champagne, always had, even as a girl. Father used to joke that she'd been born with French tastes." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about the toast, Mr. Blackwood, the traditional toast to the bride and groom." Something flickered across Geoffrey's face. Too quick for me to identify, but Holmes's eyes narrowed fractionally. "The toast? Yes." Geoffrey set down his glass and I noticed his hands had steadied. It was approximately 2:00. The photographer, Mr. Cartwright, wanted formal pictures. We stood in the traditional formation, Victoria and James in the centre, myself beside Victoria as her guardian and brother, the best man beside James, and the bridesmaids arranged around us, 6 of us total, all holding crystal flutes. Describe the positioning precisely if you would. I stood to Victoria's left, James to her right. Behind James was Thomas Weatherby, the best man. The bridesmaids, Miss Pemberton and Miss Crawford, stood behind Victoria. We raised our glasses. The photographer asked us to hold position while he prepared the exposure. Victoria raised her glass. His voice caught. She was smiling. God help me, she was smiling when she drank. "How long between the toast and when symptoms appeared?" Geoffrey's brow furrowed. "Perhaps 30 minutes. She danced with James first, then with several guests. She seemed perfectly well. Then she mentioned feeling warm, attributed it to the excitement and the dancing. But then..." He pressed his hand to his face. "She began to sway, said her fingers felt numb. James caught her as she fell." "Where precisely did she collapse?" "In the portrait gallery. She'd stepped away from the ballroom, needed air, she said. I found them there, James holding her, shouting for the doctor. She was convulsing, couldn't breathe properly. Her face. He stopped, unable to continue. Holmes stood abruptly. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You've been most helpful. One final question. The champagne. Who poured it? The butler, Price. He'd set out the glasses on a silver tray, filled them from the same bottles used throughout the breakfast. James handed Victoria her glass personally. I remember because he was quite particular about selecting one with perfect clarity. Said he wanted that moment to be flawless. And you yourself? Well, where did you get your glass? From the same tray. We all did. Holmes nodded slowly. I see. Rest now, Mr. Blackwood. We shall speak again. As we left the library, Lestrade whispered, He seems genuinely devastated. Seems, Holmes repeated. An interesting word, Inspector. Note how his hands trembled when we entered, yet steadied as he described the toast. Note how his grief overwhelms him when speaking emotionally, yet his recall of the toast formation was extraordinarily precise, almost as if he'd rehearsed it. You suspect the brother? I asked quietly. I suspect everyone, Watson. But yes, Geoffrey Blackwood bears watching. The portrait gallery was a long room lined with paintings of Blackwood ancestors, their severe faces watching our entry with painted disapproval. The body of Victoria Blackwood lay upon a chaise longue, covered with a white sheet. Dr. Pemberton, a silver-haired man of 60, stood nearby with the bearing of one who had witnessed death too often to be undone by it. Mr. Holmes, he said, inclining his head. Inspector Lestrade mentioned you were coming. I've preserved the scene as requested. Most kind. Holmes moved to the chaise, but his eyes were scanning the room itself. The distance from the door, the windows, the positioning of furniture. He knelt beside a small table. This was knocked over. When she fell, her hand struck it. Holmes examined the floor minutely, producing his lens. He collected something invisible to my eyes and placed it in an envelope. Only then did he approach the body. Watson, your examination, please. I drew back the sheet and felt my breath catch despite years of medical practice. And Victoria Blackwood had been beautiful. Dark hair, fine features, a face that would have radiated joy hours earlier. Now it bore the unmistakable signs of violent death. The skin showed a faint bluish tinge, the lips were parted, and the eyes held a terrible awareness. Dr. Pemberton, walk me through the symptoms. The physician consulted his notes. Initial complaint of warmth and tingling in the extremities. Progression to numbness spreading from fingers and toes. Difficulty breathing developed rapidly. Convulsions began approximately 5 minutes after first symptoms. Pupils were dilated. Pulse became irregular, then failed. Death occurred from respiratory paralysis leading to cardiac arrest. Classic aconitine presentation, I murmured, examining the oral cavity. See here, Holmes, the perioral tingling indicators. The blue tinge from respiratory failure. Holmes leaned close, studying the victim's face with an intensity that bordered on reverence. She knew she was dying, Watson. Aconitine allows consciousness almost to the end. Imagine it, realizing you've been poisoned, feeling your body fail, unable to speak, unable to name your murderer. He straightened, his expression grim. Dr. Pemberton, when could the poison have been administered? Based on symptom onset, I'd estimate 30 to 40 minutes before first complaints. Aconitine acts relatively quickly when ingested, though timing varies with dose and individual physiology. The toast, I said. Geoffrey mentioned 30 minutes between drinking and symptoms. Precisely. Holmes began pacing the length of the gallery. Poisoned during the toast, symptoms manifest during the dancing, and death follows swiftly. The timing is significant, gentlemen. Our murderer chose a method with delayed action. Why? To establish an alibi, Lestrade suggested. Possibly. Or to ensure the victim was away from the source of poisoning before symptoms appeared. Consider. If she'd collapsed immediately after the toast, suspicion would have focused on the champagne, on whoever poured it, on that specific moment. But 30 minutes allows for dozens of alternative theories. She could have eaten poisoned food, drunk poisoned water, even been poisoned before the ceremony. But she wasn't, I said. The symptoms are too acute. This was a single, large dose. Indeed, which narrows our window considerably. Holmes turned to Dr. Pemberton. The body may be moved. I've seen what I needed. As the doctor withdrew to make arrangements, Holmes crossed to the portraits lining the wall. He stopped before a severe-faced man in judicial robes. Magistrate Harrison Blackwood, Lestrade supplied, died 5 years ago. Heart failure, though there were rumours of his disappointment in his son's gambling habits. Were there indeed? Holmes murmured. And what of the daughter's inheritance? Substantial, I understand. £50,000 held in trust. With her marriage, control would transfer to her directly, or to her husband as her legal representative. And had she died unmarried? The trust would remain under the brother's control as executor. Holmes turned from the portrait, his face unreadable. £50,000. A powerful motive for murder, Inspector. Strong enough to overcome even fraternal affection, if such existed. You think Geoffrey Blackwood killed his own sister? Lestrade's scepticism was evident. The man's destroyed by grief. What I think and what I can prove are different matters. Holmes moved toward the door. Watson, have you concluded your examination? I have. The cause of death is clear enough. Aconitine poisoning, almost certainly administered through the champagne at the toast. There's no other explanation for the timing. Then we have our method and our approximate timeline. Holmes paused at the gallery entrance, looking back at the covered form on the chaise. What we lack is our mechanism. How does one poison a specific glass of champagne before 200 witnesses? Answer that, gentlemen, and we have our murderer. We reconvened in the ballroom, where the wedding decorations now seemed to mock us. Wilting flowers, half-empty champagne bottles, the three-tiered cake standing untouched like a monument to interrupted joy. Holmes moved through the space like a hunting animal, examining the arrangement of tables, the positions where guests had stood, the location of the champagne service. The glasses were here, Lestrade indicated a side table. The butler Price arranged them on silver trays before the ceremony. Multiple bottles were opened for the toast. Holmes examined the remaining bottles and glasses with his lens. All from the same crystal pattern. Expensive, matched set. No visible marks of tampering on the bottles themselves. He lifted one glass to the light. Watson, does anything strike you about this crystal? I examined it. Fine quality. Perhaps 30 glasses in the set, all identical. Precisely. Identical. Holmes set it down carefully. If one wished to poison a specific person's glass, one would need to ensure they drank from the poisoned vessel and no other. How does one guarantee Victoria Blackwood receives the lethal dose? Geoffrey said James handed her the glass personally, I offered. He chose one specifically for its clarity. Yes, and that troubles me greatly. Holmes turned to face us. Consider the risk. Price pours the champagne into identical glasses. They sit on a tray, anyone available to any guest. James Hartley selects one. But how can he be certain which glass? How can the murderer be certain Victoria will receive the poisoned one and not some innocent guest? The implication settled over us like a shroud. Unless, Lestrade said slowly, the glass wasn't poisoned when it was poured. Excellent, Inspector, Holmes's eyes gleamed. Now you begin to see the puzzle. The poison was administered after the glasses were filled, but before they were drunk. That narrows our window to mere minutes, possibly seconds. And it must have occurred in front of 200 witnesses. An impossible crime, I murmured. No crime is impossible, Watson, merely improbable. And the improbable, as I've often noted, is merely the not yet explained. He consulted his pocket watch. Nearly 8 o'clock. Too late for outdoor examination, and I suspect the crucial evidence lies not in the grounds but in human behaviour. What would you have us do? Lestrade asked. Bring me the wedding photographer's work. Every photograph taken today, particularly of the toast sequence, where I question the guests about who stood where during that critical moment, and find me the champagne glass Victoria Blackwood drank from. It must be somewhere. We've searched, Mr. Holmes. It's not among the glasses collected from the ballroom. Then it was removed. By whom and why? Holmes moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing, Lestrade. Geoffrey Blackwood mentioned his sister loved champagne. Question the servants. I want to know if Victoria Blackwood had particular habits regarding champagne, how she drank it, whether she was fastidious about her glass, anything that might be significant. As we prepared to retire for the evening, rooms had been prepared for us in the Manor's east wing, I found Holmes standing at a window overlooking the darkened grounds. You have a theory, I said. It wasn't a question. I have several, who were all unsatisfactory. He tapped his fingers against the glass. The method eludes me, Watson. How does one poison a specific glass in plain sight? And why choose such a risky approach when simpler methods exist? Perhaps the murderer is mad. No, This required planning, preparation, knowledge of chemistry and timing. Our murderer is coldly rational. He turned from the window. Somewhere in this house, someone practiced the murder, planned every detail, and believed themselves clever enough to deceive even 200 witnesses. Then they didn't account for Sherlock Holmes. The ghost of his old smile crossed his face. Let us hope not, Watson. Let us hope not. For if they did, we are dealing with a mind as formidable as my own, and that, my friend, you would make them very dangerous indeed. Thunder rumbled in the distance as storm clouds gathered over Surrey. Somewhere in Blackwood Manor a murderer slept, or lay awake, wondering if they had been clever enough. By morning, Holmes would begin to dismantle their carefully constructed lies. Chapter 3. The wedding party assembled. Morning brought no comfort to Blackwood Manor. I woke to find Holmes already dressed and standing at the bedroom window, smoking his pipe as he surveyed the grounds below. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the gardens washed clean and glistening under pale autumn sunlight. "You haven't slept," I observed, noting the ashtray filled with the remains of at least a dozen cigarettes. "Sleep is a luxury for minds at peace, Watson. Mine is considerably agitated." He gestured toward the grounds. "I've been watching the staff prepare for the day. Fascinating study in human behaviour. Some move as though nothing has happened. Others can barely function. Guilt manifests in curious ways. Or grief. Indeed. The challenge is distinguishing one from the other." He turned from the window. "Dress quickly. Lestrade has assembled the principal members of the wedding party in the library at my request. I intend to reconstruct the toast formation precisely as it occurred. Sometimes the body remembers what the mind conceals." An hour later we gathered in the manor's vast library. Morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating the assembled company with merciless clarity. Geoffrey Blackwood looked haggard but composed, dressed in black mourning clothes. Beside him stood a man of perhaps 35, handsome in a careless way, with the kind of face that suggested life had been generous to him, until now. "Mr. James Hartley," Lestrade introduced quietly, "the bridegroom." Hartley's appearance shocked me. His eyes were hollow, his face unshaven, his evening dress from the previous day now rumpled and stained. He looked like a man who had stared into an abyss and found it staring back. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice rough, "they tell me you can solve impossible crimes. Can you solve this? Can you tell me why my wife—" his voice broke, "why Victoria died on what should have been the happiest day of our lives?" Holmes regarded him with that peculiar intensity. "I can tell you how she died, Mr. Hartley, and who killed her. Whether that brings you comfort is another matter entirely." "Comfort?" A bitter laugh escaped Hartley's lips. "There is no comfort. I handed her that glass myself. I chose it carefully, wanted it to be perfect, and it killed her." "You selected her champagne glass specifically?" "Yes, from the tray where Price had arranged them. I wanted—" He pressed his hand to his face. "I thought I was being romantic, attentive, and instead I handed her poison." "James," Geoffrey interjected, his tone sharp, "you couldn't have known." "Couldn't I?" Hartley turned on him with sudden vehemence. "Perhaps I should have. Perhaps we all should have." Before Geoffrey could respond, the library door opened again. A woman entered, tall, elegant, dressed in black silk that seemed almost aggressive in its formality. Her face bore the kind of beauty that came from good bones rather than youth, and her eyes held a cold intelligence. "Lady Cordelia Ashworth," Lestrade murmured. "I received your summons, Inspector," she said, her voice crisp, "though I question what assistance I can provide. I was merely a guest at the wedding." "Merely?" Geoffrey's laugh was harsh. "You wrote letters to my sister warning her against the marriage. You called James a fortune hunter, and worse." Lady Cordelia's expression didn't change. "I wrote what was true. Mr. Hartley was engaged to me until he learned Victoria's trust was substantially larger than mine, and suddenly his affections shifted. Remarkable coincidence, wouldn't you say?" "How dare you—" Hartley began, but Holmes interrupted. "Please contain yourselves. This is not a drawing-room drama, but a murder investigation." He moved to the centre of the room. "Lady Cordelia, you admit to writing letters to the deceased?" "I admit to writing warnings, yes. Victoria showed them to me when she confronted me. They were bitter, perhaps, but not threatening, unlike the anonymous letters she received." This was news. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Anonymous letters?" "Terrible things," Geoffrey said quietly. Threats, vile accusations. Victoria was frightened by them. I gave them to the local inspector. Lestrade produced a folder from his coat. Here, Mr. Holmes. 3 letters, all unsigned, all delivered in the week before the wedding. Holmes examined them briefly, his lens out. Different hand entirely from Lady Cordelia's correspondence. Cruder paper, cheaper ink. These were meant to terrify. He looked up at her. You are aware, Lady Cordelia, that these letters cast considerable suspicion upon you. I am aware, Mr. Holmes, that I have been made a convenient scapegoat. But I did not write those letters, and I did not kill Victoria Blackwood, whatever crimes of the heart James Hartley may have committed. My business is failing, Hartley said suddenly, surprising us all. There, I've said it. Hartley Shipping is bankrupt. Has been for months. I needed... He stopped, seemed to gather himself. Victoria knew. I told her before the engagement. She said she didn't care, that love mattered more than money, and I believed her. I wanted to believe her. How convenient, Lady Cordelia said coldly, that your bride dies before the trust transfers to her control, leaving you with nothing but debts and a widow's portion. How dare you suggest... Enough! Holmes's voice cut through the rising argument like a blade. You will contain your theatrics or leave this room. Now, all of you, come with me. We're going to the ballroom. The ballroom still showed signs of the previous day's tragedy. Tables pushed aside, chairs scattered, the champagne service area marked by police tape. Holmes directed everyone to stand in specific positions near the photographer's platform. Mr. Hartley, you stood here, beside your bride. Geoffrey Blackwood to her left. Lady Cordelia, where were you during the toast? By the window, with several friends who can attest to my location. Note that, Lestrade. Holmes gestured to another man who had entered quietly, a younger fellow with an uncomfortable expression. And you are? Thomas Weatherby, sir. Best man. Ah, yes. You helped arrange the champagne glasses before the ceremony, I understand. Weatherby's discomfort increased visibly. I did, yes. Price asked me to help set them on the trays. I had no idea. I swear, Mr. Holmes, I had nothing to do with... Where were you during the toast itself? The young man's face flushed scarlet. I needed air. The conservatory. He was with me, came a soft voice from the doorway. A young woman entered, clearly mortified. Miss Sarah Pemberton, I'm a bridesmaid. Thomas and I, we were indisposed. A romantic assignation, Holmes said flatly. How inconvenient for your alibi, Mr. Weatherby. Or how convenient, depending on one's perspective. I loved Victoria, Weatherby said suddenly miserably. Since we were children, I never told her. And when she announced her engagement to James, I couldn't bear to watch. But I would never, ever have harmed her. Yet you missed your best friend's wedding toast to cavort with a bridesmaid? Holmes's tone was scalpel sharp. I'm not proud of it, but it kept me from doing something foolish, from objecting or making a scene. Sarah helped me. I did, Miss Pemberton said quietly. Thomas was distraught. I thought keeping him occupied would prevent embarrassment. Holmes studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. Your presence provides mutual alibi. Note that as well, Lestrade. He turned to the assembled group. Now then, Geoffrey, James, I want you to stand exactly as you stood during the toast. Miss Pemberton, you as well. As they arranged themselves, an elderly woman entered the ballroom with the rigid bearing of Victorian propriety. She was dressed in severe black, her silver hair pulled back tightly, her face an expressionless mask. Mrs. Dorothea Blackwood, Geoffrey said tonelessly. My aunt. Victoria's chaperone. Former chaperone, the woman corrected icily, until she chose to disregard my counsel and marry a penniless adventurer. Her gaze settled on Hartley with undisguised contempt. Mrs. Blackwood, Holmes said, you supervised the food and drink preparation for the wedding. I supervised everything. The Blackwood name means something in this county, Mr. Holmes. Standards must be maintained. And you approved of the marriage? I did not. Victoria was headstrong, foolish. This marriage was a terrible mistake. Strong words, madam. Honest words. Though I would never, she stopped herself, lips pressed into a thin line. Would never what, Mrs. Blackwood? Would never have wished her dead despite my disapproval. She was my brother's daughter. Family is sacred. Holmes moved closer to her. You have a key to the poison garden, do you not? The reaction was immediate, a flash of something in her eyes quickly suppressed. My late brother cultivated medicinal plants. The garden has been locked since his death. Geoffrey and I are the only key holders. And when did you last access this garden? I haven't entered it in months, Mr. Holmes, perhaps years. It holds painful memories. Holmes nodded slowly, but I could see his mind working behind those sharp eyes. Very well. Now all of you, maintain your positions. Geoffrey, you were beside Victoria. Your hand was in your waistcoat pocket, according to the photographer's testimony. Geoffrey's face went carefully blank. Perhaps. I don't recall. It was all quite overwhelming. Try to remember. Everyone raised their glasses. You were photographed. Your hand was here. Holmes touched his own waistcoat. Why? Adjusting my pocket watch, perhaps. Or simply nervous gesture. One does fidget during such moments. Indeed. Holmes stepped back, surveying the arrangement. The photographer, Mr. Cartwright, will arrive this afternoon with his plates. Until then, you're all to remain on the estate. No one leaves without my express permission. As the group began to disperse, still throwing suspicious glances at one another, Holmes caught my arm. Watson, walk with me. I require your medical expertise for a physical examination of the grounds. We left through the conservatory doors, stepping into the bright morning. The garden was extensive. Formal beds near the house giving way to ornamental shrubs and a large fountain at the garden's centre. What are we looking for? I asked. Evidence? Watson. Always evidence. He moved toward the fountain with purposeful strides. Our murderer disposed of the poisoned glass somewhere. It wasn't in the ballroom, wasn't in the gallery. Logic suggests. He stopped abruptly at the fountain's edge, staring down into the water. I joined him and felt my breath catch. There, partially submerged beneath a lily pad, gleamed the unmistakable crystal facets of a champagne flute. Holmes produced a handkerchief and reached into the water, lifting the glass carefully. It was identical to the wedding crystal, same pattern, same size, but as he held it to the light, I could see faint residue along the rim. Well, well, Holmes murmured. Our missing murder weapon. Carefully rinsed, but not carefully enough. Watson, see here. He pointed to almost imperceptible scratching along the base. Whoa, crystal against crystal, as if this glass had been handled while concealed against another. Why dispose of it here, I wondered. Because our murderer believed the death would be attributed to natural causes, or at least to earlier poisoning. By the time suspicion focused on the toast, the evidence would be long gone, dissolved by water, overlooked in the chaos. His eyes gleamed with that dangerous light I knew so well, but they underestimated the speed of detection, the physician's immediate recognition of poisoning, Lestrade's swift action in sealing the estate. He stood, cradling the glass carefully. Lestrade, he called toward the house, bring me an evidence container. We have our murder weapon. As the inspector hurried toward us, Holmes turned to me with grim satisfaction. The net begins to tighten, Watson. Someone in that house practiced switching champagne glasses. Someone knew exactly how to execute sleight of hand before 200 witnesses, and someone made the fatal error of assuming their cleverness would go undetected. But who? I asked, though suspicion was already forming in my mind. Patience, my friend. We have the weapon. Soon we shall have the method, and once we have the method, he smiled without humour, we shall have our murderer. The champagne glass gleamed in the morning sunlight, its crystal facets catching the light like diamonds. Somewhere in the house behind us, a killer was beginning to realise that Sherlock Holmes had found the first thread that would unravel their carefully woven web. And Holmes, I knew, would pull that thread until the entire tapestry of lies came crashing down. Chapter 4. The Poison Garden. The discovery of the champagne glass had energised Holmes in a way I recognised from our most complex cases. He moved through the remainder of the morning with barely contained intensity, firing questions at the servants, examining every bottle from the wedding breakfast, and conducting a meticulous inventory of the ballroom's contents. By early afternoon, he announced his next objective. The poison garden, Watson. I must see it immediately. Lestrade accompanied us, along with Geoffrey Blackwood, who produced the key with visible reluctance. I don't understand the necessity, Mr. Holmes. That garden hasn't been disturbed in years. My father used it for his toxicology research. He was something of a scholar on the subject. But since his death, it's been locked and forgotten. Humour me, Mr. Blackwood. Holmes's tone brooked no argument. We followed a gravel path to the far corner of the estate, where a high brick wall enclosed a space perhaps 30 feet square. The iron gate bore a weathered sign, "Poison Garden, no entry." Geoffrey unlocked it with hands that trembled slightly, from grief or something else I could not say. The garden within was unlike anything I had encountered. Whereas the manor's ornamental gardens showed cheerful disarray, this space possessed an almost sinister orderliness. Each bed was clearly labelled with Latin names and skull and crossbone symbols. I recognised belladonna with its dark berries, the distinctive leaves of foxglove, the delicate white flowers of hemlock. But the largest bed, positioned in full sunlight near the garden's centre, contained tall stalks of deep purple flowers. Aconitum napellus, Holmes read from the label, monkshood, wolfsbane. He knelt beside the bed, producing his lens. "Watson, observe the soil." I crouched beside him. The earth showed clear signs of recent disturbance. Several plants had been cut at the stem, leaving fresh breaks that couldn't be more than a few weeks old. An elderly man appeared at the garden gate, cap in hand. He had the weathered face and strong hands of one who had spent a lifetime working the earth. "Begging your pardon, sirs. I'm Thomas Wickham, head gardener. They told me you'd come to see the poison garden." "Mr. Wickham," Holmes said, rising. "You maintain this garden?" "Aye, sir, I maintain it, but I don't disturb it." "Mr. Blackwood," the elder Mr. Blackwood, God rest him, he gave me strict instructions. Keep the beds tidy, prevent overgrowth, but never cut the plants without his express permission. "Never?" "Well, sir, he sometimes requested samples for his laboratory work, but that was years ago before he passed." Holmes indicated the wolfsbane bed. "These plants were cut recently, within the past month, I'd estimate." Old Thomas's weathered face creased with concern. "That can't be right, sir. Last time I cut from this bed was 2 months past, maybe more. Mr. Geoffrey, the younger Mr. Geoffrey, he asked for samples for his father's old laboratory, said he was cataloguing the late master's research." Geoffrey's face had gone pale. "I did request samples, yes, 2 months ago, as Thomas says, but I haven't been back since." "Yet these cuts are fresh," Holmes insisted, running his finger along a stem. 3, perhaps 4 weeks old. "The sap has barely dried." "Then someone else cut them," Geoffrey said, his voice rising slightly. "The key. I sometimes leave it in the potting shed when I'm working in the gardens. Anyone could have taken it." "Could they?" Holmes's tone was dangerously soft. "Or is it more likely that the person with legitimate access, the person with knowledge of toxicology inherited from his father, the person who specifically requested wolfsbane samples, is it not more likely that person returned for a second harvest?" "I did no such thing." "Show me your father's laboratory," Holmes commanded. The laboratory was housed in a converted garden shed, surprisingly spacious and well-equipped. Glass beakers and distillation apparatus lined wooden shelves. Reference books on chemistry and toxicology filled a small bookcase. A workbench held various equipment, all scrupulously clean. Holmes examined everything with painstaking care. He opened notebooks filled with the elder Blackwood's cramped handwriting, pages of chemical formulas and experimental notes. One journal in particular caught his attention. "Aconitin extraction methods," he read aloud. "Your father was quite thorough in his research, Mr. Blackwood. Multiple approaches, careful documentation of yields and potency." He looked up. "Did you continue his work?" "I've been cataloguing it, as I said." Father was brilliant but disorganised. I thought perhaps his research might be publishable, might bring some recognition to his memory. Noble. Holmes moved to the distillation apparatus, examining it with his lens. "Though this equipment shows recent use. See here, Watson. Residue in the collection flask. A crystalline structure consistent with alkaloid extraction." I peered at the faint traces. "It does appear to be recent. The residue hasn't fully dried." "Could have been from my work 2 months ago," Geoffrey protested. "I cleaned the equipment, but perhaps not thoroughly enough." Holmes produced a small spatula and scraped a sample into an envelope. "We shall see. A simple chemical analysis will determine the age of this residue." He turned to face Geoffrey directly. "Mr. Blackwood, I put it to you. You harvested wolfsbane from this garden within the past month. You extracted aconitine using your father's equipment and methods. The question is, why?" "This is outrageous." Geoffrey's face flushed with anger. "I loved my sister. The suggestion that I could, it's monstrous." "Is it?" Holmes's voice was ice. "You stand to inherit her fortune. £50,000, enough to solve any number of financial difficulties. I don't have financial difficulties. Don't you? Holmes produced a folded newspaper from his coat. Yesterday's racing forms, Mr. Blackwood. I found them in your study this morning. Extensive betting notations, all recent. Lestrade, I suggest you obtain Mr. Blackwood's financial records. I suspect they will prove illuminating. Geoffrey's defiance crumbled. He sank onto a laboratory stool, head in his hands. Yes, I gamble. I've made poor choices. Father's death left me with responsibilities I wasn't prepared for. The estate, Victoria's welfare, managing the trust. It was overwhelming. I sought distraction in cards, in horses, and yes, I've lost money, substantial sums. How substantial? Enough that I've had to borrow from the estate accounts. Victoria didn't know. I planned to repay it once the harvest came in, once I could settle my debts. And did Victoria's marriage threaten that plan? Holmes pressed. With her marriage, an audit would be required before trust transfer, an audit that would reveal your embezzlement. I didn't kill her. Geoffrey looked up, his face desperate. Yes, the audit worried me. Yes, I've been a fool, but I didn't poison my own sister. Holmes studied him for a long moment. Then explain the wolfsbane, explain the laboratory residue, explain why all evidence points to your involvement. I can't explain it, because I didn't do it. Geoffrey stood abruptly. Someone is framing me, Mr. Holmes. Someone who knew about my gambling, my access to the poison garden, my work in the laboratory. Someone who wanted Victoria dead and wanted me to take the blame. A convenient theory, Lestrade muttered. But not impossible, I interjected. Holmes, could someone have used Geoffrey's access, taken the key from the potting shed as he claims? Holmes didn't answer immediately. He was examining the laboratory's window which faced the main gardens. This shed is visible from the house. Anyone could observe comings and goings. The potting shed where the key is allegedly kept. Where is it? Adjacent to the greenhouse, Geoffrey said. Perhaps 50 yards from here. Show me. The potting shed was a cluttered space filled with tools, seed packets and clay pots. A row of hooks on the wall held various keys, each labelled with wooden tags. Poison Garden read one tag, hanging from an empty hook. The key is supposed to be here when not in use, Geoffrey explained. I admit I'm not always diligent about returning it. Sometimes I leave it in the laboratory if I'm working there regularly. Holmes examined the hooks, the shed's interior, even the dust patterns on the floor. Footprints, he murmured. Several sets, overlapping. Impossible to distinguish individual visitors. He turned to old Thomas, who had followed us. Who has access to this shed? Anyone who works the gardens, sir. 3 groundskeepers, the undergardener, myself. Mrs. Blackwood comes here sometimes for cutting flowers. The household staff fetch tools as needed. In other words, virtually anyone at the manor. I suppose so, sir. Holmes's expression was unreadable as we walked back toward the house. Lestrade pulled me aside. What do you make of it, Doctor? Is Geoffrey Blackwood a murderer or a scapegoat? I don't know, I admitted. The evidence certainly points toward him. The gambling debts provide motive, the poison garden provides means, and he had ample opportunity during the toast. But something doesn't fit. Would he really be so obvious? Leave so clear a trail? Unless he thought his position as grieving brother would shield him from suspicion. Perhaps. But I thought of Geoffrey's desperate protest. Someone is framing me. Could there be truth to it? Holmes was waiting for us at the manor's entrance. Lestrade, I want that laboratory residue analysed immediately. Send it to your best chemist with instructions for complete alkaloid testing. Also, obtain records of all of Geoffrey Blackwood's financial transactions for the past year. Bank accounts, club memberships, betting establishments. Everything. Right you are, Mr. Holmes. And Watson, Holmes continued as we entered the house. I want you to speak with Mrs. Blackwood, the aunt. She mentioned the poison garden held painful memories. I want to know what she meant by that. You suspect her involvement? I suspect everyone until proven otherwise. He paused at the foot of the grand staircase. But yes, Mrs. Dorothea Blackwood interests me considerably. She had access to the poison garden, knowledge of the household routines, and clearly disapproved of the marriage. Strong disapproval combined with opportunity makes for dangerous possibilities. But her motive? Family honour, perhaps? Or inheritance? If both siblings died without heirs, where would the Blackwood fortune go? His eyes gleamed. Research the family will, Watson. Follow the money. It rarely lies. I found Mrs. Dorothea Blackwood in the morning room, attending to correspondence with rigid formality, despite the tragedy that had befallen the household. She looked up as I entered, her expression cold. Dr. Watson, have you come to interrogate me as your friend interrogated my nephew? I've come to ask about the poison garden, I said gently. You mentioned it held painful memories. For a moment her composure cracked. My brother, Harrison, he loved that garden, spent hours there, cultivating his specimens, conducting his research. He was a brilliant man, Doctor. Brilliant but troubled. She set down her pen. His interest in poisons was professional initially. As a magistrate, he encountered numerous poisoning cases. He wanted to understand the science, to better serve justice. But it became more than professional. It became an obsession. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Toward the end, he spent more time in that laboratory than with his children. Victoria and Geoffrey were practically raised by servants. By me. Did his death have anything to do with the poisons? Her eyes flashed. The official cause was heart failure, but I've always wondered. She stopped herself. It's not proper to speak ill of the dead. Mrs. Blackwood, if you know something relevant to this investigation, I know that my brother played with dangerous substances and died unexpectedly. I know that his son inherited both his intelligence and his weaknesses, and I know that Victoria deserved better than to die at her own wedding. Her hands clenched into fists. If Geoffrey is responsible, if he used his father's damned research to murder his own sister, I will see him hang, nephew or no. And if he's innocent, then someone else accessed that garden, that laboratory. Someone else knew about Harrison's work. She met my eyes. There are only 3 people who knew the full extent of my brother's toxicology research. Myself, Geoffrey, and Dr. Pemberton, the family physician. He sometimes assisted Harrison in his experiments. This was new information. Dr. Pemberton worked with the late magistrate. They were colleagues, almost friends. Pemberton provided medical knowledge. Harrison provided legal context. Together they documented dozens of poisoning cases. She paused. You might ask Dr. Pemberton why he diagnosed aconitine poisoning so quickly. Most physicians wouldn't recognise it. But Pemberton has extensive experience with the symptoms. I found Holmes in the library poring over documents that Lestrade had obtained from Geoffrey's study. He looked up as I entered and shared Mrs. Blackwood's revelations. Dr. Pemberton, Holmes murmured. How interesting. Watson, you examined Victoria's body with him present. Did he seem surprised by anything? I thought back. No, actually. He seemed almost expectant, as if he knew what he would find. Because he'd seen aconitine poisoning before, in the late magistrate's experiments, Holmes stood abruptly. We need to speak with Dr. Pemberton, immediately. But before we could leave the library, a commotion arose from the entrance hall. Lestrade's voice, raised in alarm, drew us quickly to the scene. The inspector stood at the front door holding a telegram. His face was ashen. Mr. Holmes, Doctor, there's been a development. The chemist in London has analysed the fountain glass. The residue is indeed aconitine, concentrated and extremely potent. But there's something else. He consulted the telegram again. The chemical signature matches samples from the late Magistrate Blackwood's laboratory, specifically from experiments conducted 5 years ago, shortly before his death. Holmes went very still. 5 years ago? According to the chemist, the preparation method is identical to samples archived from the magistrate's final research. Someone didn't just extract fresh aconitine, Mr. Holmes. They used the magistrate's original supply, a supply that's been stored somewhere in this house for 5 years. The implications hung in the air like poison gas. i.e., someone had been planning this murder for years, waiting, preparing, biding their time, and somewhere in Blackwood Manor that someone was listening to our every move, wondering if we were getting too close. Holmes's face was set like granite. "Search the house," he commanded. "Every room, every cupboard, every hidden space. Find me that stored poison. Find me the connection between the magistrate's death and his daughter's murder." "You think the two are related?" "I think, Lestrade," Holmes said quietly, "that we are dealing with a longer game than any of us imagined, and I fear that before this is over we shall uncover secrets that have been buried for 5 years. Thunder rumbled again in the distance. Another storm was coming. Chapter 5. The Photographer's Evidence. The search of Blackwood Manor consumed the rest of the afternoon. Lestrade's men moved through every room with methodical precision, opening cupboards, examining cellars, probing the attics. Holmes supervised personally, his keen eyes missing nothing. But as evening approached, we had found no cache of 5-year-old poison, no hidden supply of aconitine prepared by the late magistrate. "It has to be here," Lestrade muttered, frustrated. The chemist was certain. The chemical signature matched archived samples from Harrison Blackwood's final experiments. "Then either it's extraordinarily well hidden," Holmes replied, "or it's been kept somewhere we haven't thought to look. A place so obvious we've overlooked it." "The laboratory," I suggested. "Already searched thoroughly. Unless—" Holmes paused. "Watson, the magistrate's personal effects. Where would they be stored?" Geoffrey, who had been hovering anxiously throughout the search, answered, "Father's study. Most of his things are still there. We couldn't bring ourselves to clear it out after he died." "Show me." The late magistrate's study was a shrine to Victorian scholarship. Leather-bound law books, medical texts, and shelves upon shelves of journals documenting poisoning cases. A large desk dominated the room, its surface still arranged as if its occupant might return at any moment. Holmes went immediately to the desk drawers. "Locked," he observed, examining an ornate writing case built into the desk's centre. "Mr. Blackwood, the key. I don't know where it is. Father always kept it on his person." Holmes produced his lockpicks without hesitation. Within moments the drawer slid open, revealing bundles of correspondence, legal documents, and— "Good Lord," I breathed. A small mahogany box, no larger than a cigar case, sat nestled among the papers. Holmes lifted it carefully. The lid bore a brass plate engraved with a single word: aconitum. Inside, secured in velvet-lined compartments, were 3 glass vials. 2 were empty. The third contained perhaps an ounce of clear liquid. 5 years, Holmes murmured, holding 1 empty vial to the light. Prepared, labelled, and hidden by a dying man. The question is, why? Perhaps Father was conducting experiments when he fell ill, Geoffrey suggested weakly. He could have forgotten about them. Or, Holmes said quietly, he prepared them for a specific purpose we have yet to understand. He turned the box over, examining it from every angle. A folded paper fell from beneath the velvet lining. Holmes unfolded it carefully. It was a letter written in a shaking hand. "If this is found after my death, let it be known that I prepared these samples for documentation purposes only, as evidence in potential future poisoning cases. They are precisely measured. Each vial contains a lethal dose. They must be destroyed immediately upon my death. The danger they represent is beyond measure. God forgive me for creating them. H.B." "Destroyed immediately upon his death," Lestrade read over Holmes's shoulder. "But they weren't." "No," Holmes agreed. "Someone knew they were here. Someone waited 5 years for the perfect opportunity to use them." His eyes fixed on Geoffrey. "Who had access to this study?" "After Father died?" "Myself, Aunt Dorothea, the household staff for cleaning purposes." "Did Victoria have access?" "Of course. It was her home." "And Mr. Hartley?" "Before the wedding?" Geoffrey hesitated. "James visited several times during their engagement. Victoria gave him tours of the house. Whether he entered this specific room, I couldn't say." A knock at the door interrupted us. A servant announced, "Mr. Cartwright, the photographer, has arrived, sir. He's brought his plates as requested." "Excellent timing," Holmes said, carefully securing the poison vials. "Lestrade, have these taken to your chemist immediately. I want confirmation that this is indeed the source of Victoria's poisoning. Come, Watson, let us see what the camera's unblinking eye can tell us." Edwin Cartwright was a nervous, precise man in his 40s, with the ink-stained fingers and careful manner of one who made his living through meticulous attention to detail. He had set up his equipment in the ballroom, spreading dozens of photographic plates across a table. "Mr. Holmes," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "I've developed every exposure from the wedding. As requested, I've made particular note of the toast sequence." Holmes bent over the table with barely contained eagerness. "You took multiple exposures of the toast?" "3, sir. The first was poorly composed. I was still adjusting my angle. The second captured the moment perfectly. The third was taken immediately after they drank to capture the celebratory atmosphere." He laid out 3 large photographic plates. Even to my untrained eye, the second photograph was remarkable. Sharp, perfectly framed, catching the wedding party in formal array with glasses raised. Holmes produced his lens and examined it with microscopic attention. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "Watson, come see this." I leaned over his shoulder. The photograph showed 6 figures arranged in a semicircle. Victoria and James in the centre, Geoffrey to Victoria's left, Thomas Weatherby behind James, and the 2 bridesmaids flanking them. Every detail was crisp. The crystal glasses, the formal attire, the expressions on their faces. But as Holmes directed my attention to Geoffrey's position, I saw what had captured his interest. Geoffrey's right hand was raised, holding his champagne glass, but positioned oddly, it extended slightly forward so that it partially blocked the view of Victoria's glass in the photograph. His left hand, rather than holding his glass in the conventional 2-handed toast position, was tucked into his waistcoat pocket. "During a formal toast," Holmes said softly, "with a photographer present, with 200 guests watching, why would one hand be in one's pocket?" "Nervous habit?" I suggested. "Perhaps." "Mr. Cartwright, the exposure time for this photograph, how long?" "Approximately 3 seconds, Mr. Holmes. Long enough to ensure clarity in the indoor lighting." 3 seconds? And did anyone move during that exposure?" Cartwright consulted his notes. "No, sir. I instructed them to remain perfectly still, and they complied. Except..." He hesitated. "Except..." There was the faintest blur around Mr. Geoffrey Blackwood's waistcoat area. "See here?" He pointed to the photograph. As if there had been slight movement during the exposure. I assumed he was nervous, fidgeting perhaps. Holmes straightened slowly, or performing an action that required movement. "Mr. Cartwright, in your professional opinion, could someone switch objects, say 2 identical glasses, during a 3-second exposure without creating obvious blur?" The photographer considered this. If they moved very carefully with their body blocking direct view, and if the objects were identical, possibly, the blur would be minimal, perhaps attributable to natural fidgeting. And if someone had practiced such a movement extensively, then yes, I believe it could be done quite subtly. Holmes turned to Geoffrey, who had gone pale. "Mr. Blackwood, why was your hand in your waistcoat pocket during the toast?" I was adjusting my pocket watch, or perhaps I was nervous. I don't recall specifically. It was all rather overwhelming." "Was it?" Holmes's voice was dangerously soft. "Because Mr. Hartley mentioned that you were adjusting your waistcoat just before the photographer arrived, and now we have photographic evidence of your hand in your pocket during the formal toast itself. One might almost think you were concealing something in that pocket." "This is absurd," Geoffrey's voice rose. "You're constructing an entire murder plot from nervous fidgeting." "Am I?" Holmes moved to the centre of the ballroom. "Let me propose an alternative explanation. You arranged the toast formation yourself. Everyone has confirmed this. You positioned yourself beside Victoria, with your right hand blocking the direct view of her glass. You had a second glass concealed in your waistcoat pocket, identical to the wedding crystal, already filled with poisoned champagne from the vial in your father's desk. No, during the 3-second exposure you switched the glasses. Your right hand blocked the view while your left hand performed the exchange. The blur, Mr. Cartwright noticed, was you retrieving the poisoned glass and replacing Victoria's innocent one with it. The motion was so practiced, so smooth, that in the chaos of the moment no one noticed. I did no such thing." "Then explain," Holmes demanded, "how a conatine from your father's laboratory ended up in a champagne glass found in the fountain. Explain your hand in your pocket during the toast. Explain the fresh wolfsbane cuts in the garden you claim not to have made. Explain your gambling debts and the upcoming audit that would expose your embezzlement." "I can't explain it," Geoffrey's face was anguished, "because none of it is true. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to make me appear guilty." "Convenient," Lestrade muttered. But I found myself troubled. "Holmes," I said quietly, "the theory is sound, but there's one problem. If Geoffrey poisoned Victoria's glass during the toast, what happened to her original unpoisoned glass? He couldn't have kept it. He was observed throughout the celebration." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "An excellent point, Watson. Mr. Blackwood?" "I don't know, because I didn't do it." Geoffrey was nearly shouting now. "You're building a case on coincidences and misinterpretations. My hand was in my pocket because I was nervous. The wolfsbane was cut by someone else. I've already told you the key is accessible to anyone. The laboratory residue is from 2 months ago. And yes, I have debts, but I would never murder my own sister." "Then who would?" Holmes challenged. "I don't know, but someone who knew about the poison, who knew about my financial troubles, who wanted Victoria dead and wanted me blamed for it." Geoffrey's voice broke. Please, Mr. Holmes, I loved my sister. I would have given anything to protect her, including confessing to my embezzlement if necessary. Murder? Never. Holmes was silent for a long moment, studying Geoffrey with that penetrating gaze. Finally he turned away. Lestrade, ensure Mr. Blackwood remains on the estate. He is not to leave for any reason. Am I under arrest? Not yet. But you remain the primary suspect. Holmes gestured to the photographs. Mr. Cartwright, I'll need copies of all 3 toast exposures. Have them delivered to Baker Street. As the photographer began packing his equipment, Holmes drew me aside. Watson, what's your medical opinion? Could a man poison his own sister and maintain the appearance of grief we've witnessed? It's possible, I admitted, but Geoffrey's distress seems genuine. The trembling, the pallor, the emotional breakdowns, those are difficult to feign consistently. Difficult but not impossible, especially for someone intelligent enough to plan a murder this elaborate. He paused. Yet you have a point about the missing glass. If he switched them during the toast, he would have been left holding the unpoisoned one. How did it reach the fountain? Perhaps he had an accomplice. Who? Everyone with clear motive also has complications. Thomas Weatherby was occupied with Miss Pemberton. James Hartley needed Victoria alive to access her money. Lady Cordelia had no opportunity. Mrs. Blackwood was in the kitchens. Dr. Pemberton was attending to other guests. What about the servants? The butler Price. Arrested earlier for embezzlement but released when evidence pointed elsewhere. He had motive to harm Victoria but no clear opportunity during the toast. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. If this was accomplished with an accomplice, we're missing a connection. A servant entered with a message for Lestrade. The inspector read it and looked up grimly. The chemist's preliminary analysis, Mr. Holmes. The vial from the magistrate's desk. The poison matches exactly. Same preparation, same concentration, same chemical markers. So the murder weapon is confirmed, Holmes said, as is the source. There's more. The chemist estimates that 1 vial, if used entirely, would contain enough aconitine to kill 10 people. The 3rd vial is still full, but 2 are empty. A chill ran down my spine. 2 vials? Meaning, Holmes said slowly, enough poison for 20 lethal doses has been removed from that box. Victoria was killed with 1 dose, which raises the question, where are the other 19 doses? I finished. Holmes's expression was grim. Precisely. Either we're dealing with a poisoner who prepared far more than needed for this single murder, or this wasn't meant to be the only murder, Lestrade breathed. Somme, the ballroom, suddenly felt very cold. Somewhere in Blackwood Manor enough poison to kill a score of people was unaccounted for, and we still didn't know who had taken it, or who else might be targeted. Holmes moved to the windows looking out at the darkening gardens. Geoffrey Blackwood is either a murderer of extraordinary cunning or a remarkably convenient scapegoat. Every piece of evidence points to him, yet something doesn't fit. The missing glass, the excessive poison preparation, the 5-year wait. What are you thinking? I asked. I'm thinking, Watson, that we may be seeing only part of the picture. That this murder might be connected to something larger, something that began 5 years ago with the magistrate's death. He turned back to face us. Lestrade, I want the magistrate's death investigated. Obtain the coroner's report, interview the doctor who attended him, examine every detail of his final illness. You think Harrison Blackwood was murdered? I think it's a possibility we cannot ignore. A man who prepared lethal poisons and warned they must be destroyed. What if he prepared them not for documentation, but because he suspected someone meant him harm? What if he was warning us from beyond the grave? That's quite a leap, Mr. Holmes, Lestrade said doubtfully. Perhaps, but consider, if the magistrate was murdered 5 years ago with his own poison, and now his daughter has been murdered with the same poison, we're not looking at a single crime. We're looking at a pattern. But who would benefit from both deaths? Holmes's smile was thin and cold. Follow the money, Lestrade. Always follow the money. Who inherits if both Blackwood children are dead? Who stood in the shadows 5 years ago and stands there still, waiting, planning? He strode toward the door. Come, Watson. We have work to do. I want to know everything about Harrison Blackwood's final days. Every visitor, every symptom, every person who had opportunity. And I want to know who benefits if the entire Blackwood line is extinguished. As we left the ballroom, I glanced back at the photographs spread across the table. In the sharp clarity of the camera's eye, Geoffrey stood frozen with his hand in his waistcoat, his face composed, his sister smiling beside him with the champagne glass raised to her lips. One of them had held death in crystal, the other had drunk it unknowing. And somewhere in this house, a killer was watching, wondering if we were close enough to the truth to become the next targets. Chapter 6. Financial Ruin. I found Holmes still awake at 3 a.m, seated before the fire in our guest chambers with papers spread around him like autumn leaves. The room reeked of tobacco smoke. He had gone through nearly a full pouch of his strongest shag, a sure sign of mental agitation. "You should sleep," I said, though I knew the futility of the suggestion. "Sleep is for minds at peace, Watson. Mine is considerably troubled." He gestured to the documents. Lestrade obtained Geoffrey Blackwood's financial records from his bank and club. The picture they paint is instructive. I settled into the chair opposite and examined the papers. Bank statements showed a steady pattern of withdrawals over the past 2 years, of far exceeding any reasonable expenditure. Club ledgers revealed mounting debts, but most damning were the betting slips, hundreds of them, documenting losses at racetracks, card games and various gambling establishments throughout London and Surrey. £12,000, Holmes said quietly, at minimum, possibly more if we account for debts not yet documented. All lost within 18 months. Good God! How did he hide this from Victoria? With increasing difficulty, I imagine, the withdrawals from the estate accounts, ostensibly for maintenance and household expenses, grew larger and more frequent as his debts mounted. Holmes selected one particularly ominous document. This letter arrived at his club 3 weeks ago. Note the tone. I read the crude scrawl with growing horror. Blackwood. Our patience is exhausted. The sum of £12,400 is due immediately. We have been generous with extensions, but generosity has limits. Pay by month's end or face consequences. Your legs first, then we get creative. Consider this your final warning. The letter was unsigned, but bore the stamp of a Whitechapel establishment known for illegal gambling and loan sharking. Month's end, I murmured. That was last week. Precisely. November 30th. Geoffrey Blackwood was staring at financial ruin, physical violence and criminal prosecution, all within days. Holmes selected another paper. Here's where it becomes interesting. Look at this correspondence between Geoffrey and various creditors over the past month. I found letters from 3 different moneylenders, all with similar themes, demands for payment, threats of legal action, and notably, Geoffrey's consistent response. I will have access to substantial funds immediately after my sister's wedding. I ask only for patience until that date. He promised them payment after the wedding, I said slowly. But Victoria's marriage would trigger the trust transfer. He'd lose control of the money. Exactly, unless... Holmes left the thought hanging. Unless she died before the marriage was legally consummated. And there, Watson, we have motive sufficient to overcome even fraternal affection. He stood and began pacing. But here's what troubles me. Geoffrey is intelligent. You've seen that. Would he really leave such an obvious trail? These letters, the gambling debts, the promises of payment tied directly to Victoria's wedding date, it's practically a signed confession of intent. Perhaps he believed he'd never be suspected. The grieving brother, devastated by tragedy? Perhaps. But Holmes's tone suggested doubt. A knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Lestrade entered, looking haggard despite the early hour. "Mr. Holmes, you'll want to see this. A visitor arrived just now, claims to have urgent information, a Mr. Horace Whitfield." "The auditor," Holmes said immediately. "Show him in." Horace Whitfield was a small, precise man in his 50s, dressed in a black suit and carrying a leather document case. He had the careful manner of one who spent his life dealing with numbers and legal minutiae. "Gentlemen, I apologise for the hour, but I've only just learned of Miss Blackwood's death." He set his case on the table. "I was travelling on business and returned to find police barring access to the manor. When I learned murder was suspected, I felt duty-bound to come forward immediately. You're the family's auditor," Holmes said. "You were scheduled to review the estate's finances." I was indeed. More specifically, I was engaged to audit the trust fund left for Miss Victoria Blackwood before its transfer to her control upon marriage. He opened his case and produced an appointment book. "I've been attempting to conduct this audit for the past 6 weeks. Mr. Geoffrey Blackwood has postponed no fewer than 7 times. He laid the appointment book open. Page after page showed scheduled meetings, all marked with Geoffrey's initials and the word "postponed." in red ink. 7 times? Lestrade breathed. Yes, the most recent postponement occurred just 3 days before the wedding. Mr. Blackwood claimed he was too busy with wedding preparations to attend to business matters. He asked if we could delay until after the honeymoon. Whitfield's expression was grave. I agreed, against my better judgment. The audit was rescheduled for 3 days after the wedding ceremony. Holmes's eyes gleamed. 3 days? Tell me, Mr. Whitfield, what exactly were you auditing? The trust fund established by the late Magistrate Blackwood. Upon his death 5 years ago, he left his fortune, approximately £50,000, in trust for his daughter. The terms specified that the money would transfer to Victoria's control upon her marriage or her 30th birthday, whichever came first. And the audit's purpose? Standard practice before any trust transfer. To ensure the funds have been properly managed, that all investments are accounted for, and that the trustee, in this case, Geoffrey Blackwood, has fulfilled his fiduciary duties. What happens if the audit reveals irregularities? Whitfield's expression darkened. If embezzlement is discovered, the trustee faces criminal prosecution. Depending on the amount stolen, imprisonment is quite likely. Additionally, he would be personally liable for restoring the missing funds. And if the beneficiary dies before the trust transfers? The trust remains under the executor's control. In this case, Geoffrey would continue managing the estate until Victoria reached her 30th birthday, or until her death, whichever came first. If she died unmarried, he consulted his documents. The trust would dissolve, and the estate would pass according to the late magistrate's will, which specified the bulk of the estate to be divided between Victoria and Geoffrey, with smaller bequests to Mrs. Dorothea Blackwood and various servants. If Victoria died before the trust transferred, her portion would remain in Geoffrey's management indefinitely. Holmes leaned forward intently. Mr. Whitfield, in your professional opinion, would Geoffrey have had reason to fear this audit? The auditor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I cannot make specific accusations without evidence. However, I can say that his repeated postponements were unusual. Most trustees welcome audits as confirmation of proper stewardship. Mr. Blackwood's reluctance suggested possible concerns about what I might find. Did you share these concerns with Victoria? I wrote to her twice, advising that the audit should proceed regardless of her brother's objections. She wrote back. He produced a letter. She said she trusted her brother implicitly and saw no reason to doubt his management. She asked me to respect his wishes regarding timing. Holmes read the letter, his expression unreadable. She trusted him absolutely. To her detriment, it now appears. Whitfield gathered his documents. Gentlemen, if Geoffrey Blackwood has indeed murdered his sister to prevent an audit that would expose embezzlement, I want to assist in any way possible. That kind of betrayal of fiduciary duty is unconscionable. Most helpful, Mr. Whitfield. One final question. The marriage certificate. When must it be filed for the trust transfer to be valid? Within 48 hours of the ceremony. Miss Blackwood was married at noon yesterday. The certificate must be filed by noon on Friday. He checked his pocket watch. Which is now approximately 33 hours from now. And if she died before filing? The marriage would be legally valid, but the trust transfer would not occur. The timing is specific in the magistrate's will. The beneficiary must be alive at the moment of official filing for the transfer to complete. After Whitfield departed, the three of us sat in heavy silence. The case is complete, Lestrade said finally. Motive, means, opportunity, all pointing to Geoffrey Blackwood. Combined with the photographic evidence and the poison from his father's laboratory, Mr. Holmes, we have enough to arrest him. Do we? Holmes's tone was thoughtful. Let me summarise what we know. Geoffrey Blackwood owes £12,000 to dangerous men. Payment is due immediately. He's been embezzling from his sister's trust to cover losses. An audit scheduled for 3 days after the wedding would expose his theft, leading to prosecution and imprisonment. His sister's death before the trust transfer prevents the audit and keeps the money under his control. He has access to the murder weapon, aconitine prepared by his father 5 years ago. He arranged the toast formation. He was photographed with his hand in his waistcoat, perfectly positioned to switch glasses. The method is proven possible. The timing fits precisely. Exactly, Lestrade said with satisfaction. It's an open and shut case. Is it, though? Holmes moved to the window, staring out at the pre-dawn darkness. Consider, Lestrade. Geoffrey is intelligent enough to plan this elaborate murder. He understands chemistry, timing, sleight of hand. He executes it flawlessly before 200 witnesses. And yet, I prompted, and yet he leaves a trail of evidence that a child could follow. The gambling debts documented in his own hand, the letters promising payment after the wedding, the laboratory with recent residue, the obvious postponements of the audit, the wolfsbane cuts he claims not to have made, every piece of evidence conveniently pointing to him. You think he's being framed? Lestrade's scepticism was evident. I think it's either the work of a murderer who's simultaneously brilliant and careless, or the work of someone who wants us to think Geoffrey is guilty. Holmes turned back to us. Watson, you're a gambling man occasionally. If you owed £12,000 to violent criminals, would you murder your sister, your only family, to avoid payment? I'd like to think not. But if you were desperate enough, morally bankrupt enough to contemplate murder, would you leave such obvious evidence, or would you cover your tracks? I'd cover my tracks. Precisely. So either Geoffrey is our murderer and inexplicably careless, or someone else is our murderer and extraordinarily careful about making Geoffrey appear guilty. But who? I asked. Who else has sufficient motive? That, Watson, is what we must determine. Who benefits from both Victoria's death and Geoffrey's conviction? Who had access to the poison, knowledge of the household and opportunity during the toast? Lestrade shuffled through his notes. We've eliminated most suspects. Thomas Weatherby has a confirmed alibi. Lady Cordelia had no opportunity during the toast. James Hartley needed Victoria alive. Mrs. Dorothea Blackwood was supervising the kitchen. Doctor. Pemberton was attending other guests. The butler Price was serving champagne, but under too much observation to poison a specific glass. Unless, Holmes said slowly, we're missing something fundamental about the method, or about the timing. He began pacing again, his movements sharp with agitation. Victoria drank the poisoned champagne during the toast at approximately 2:05. Symptoms appeared at 2:35, death at 2:50. But what if... He stopped abruptly. Watson, the symptoms. Describe them again precisely. Initial warmth and tingling, progression to numbness of extremities, difficulty breathing, convulsions, respiratory paralysis, cardiac arrest. Timing from first symptom to death, approximately 15 minutes, and from ingestion to first symptom, 30 minutes more or less. Holmes's eyes narrowed. More or less. Watson, could the timing vary based on factors such as champagne consumption, food in the stomach, individual metabolism? Certainly. Aconitine absorption can be affected by numerous factors. Why? Because I'm wondering if our timeline is as fixed as we've assumed. He consulted his notes. Geoffrey said Victoria always loved champagne. What if she'd been drinking it throughout the breakfast before the toast? What if the poison was administered earlier? But the glass in the fountain had poison residue, Lestrade objected. That proves it was poisoned during the toast. Does it? Or does it prove that a poisoned glass existed? What if the glass in the fountain is a red herring itself, planted to make us focus on the toast when the actual poisoning occurred earlier? I felt my certainty wavering. Holmes, you're constructing increasingly elaborate theories to avoid the obvious conclusion. Perhaps I am, Watson. Or perhaps the obvious conclusion is exactly what someone wants us to reach. He retrieved his coat. Lestrade, I need you to do something for me. Obtain the complete guest list from the wedding. I want to know everyone who was present. Family, friends, servants, everyone. And I want to know their movements throughout the day, particularly between noon and 2:30. That's 200 people, Mr. Holmes. Then you'd best start immediately. Holmes moved toward the door. Watson and I have another line of inquiry to pursue. The magistrate's death 5 years ago. I want the full story, every detail. You still think the two deaths are connected? I think, Lestrade. Yeah, that we're seeing ripples from something that happened 5 years ago. A stone was thrown into a pond then, and the circles are still spreading. His expression was grim. Victoria Blackwood's murder may have been planned not for weeks, but for years. And if I'm right, this isn't over yet. By dawn, we were in Geoffrey's study, examining correspondence from 5 years prior. Holmes had obtained permission to search through the late magistrate's personal papers, and he worked through them with systematic precision. Here, he said finally, holding up a letter, from Harrison Blackwood to his solicitor, written 3 weeks before his death. Listen to this. I have reason to believe someone within my household bears me ill will. I cannot provide specifics without proof, but I have taken precautions. Should anything happen to me, I'd please ensure the authorities conduct a thorough investigation. My death may not be as natural as it appears." "Good God," I breathed. "He suspected he'd be murdered." "He more than suspected. He knew." Holmes found another document. His will, amended 6 months before his death. The original left everything to Geoffrey directly. The amendment created the trust for Victoria, ensuring Geoffrey couldn't access her portion until specific conditions were met. He was protecting Victoria from Geoffrey, or protecting the estate from whoever he suspected. If Geoffrey was the threat, this makes sense, but if someone else was the danger... Holmes trailed off, thinking. Watson, who inherits if both Blackwood children die? I consulted the will. Mrs. Dorothea Blackwood receives a substantial bequest, £10,000. The remainder goes to various charities and servants. £10,000, a significant sum but not worth 2 murders. Holmes sat back, frustration evident. I'm missing something, some connection that ties all these threads together. A commotion outside drew our attention. Through the study window I saw a police wagon arriving, and Lestrade emerging with several constables. We met him in the entrance hall. His face was set with grim determination. "Mr. Holmes, I've received orders from the Commissioner. The evidence against Geoffrey Blackwood is overwhelming. I'm to arrest him immediately for the murder of his sister." "Lestrade, I urge you to wait. I can't wait any longer. The man has motive, means, and opportunity. Every piece of evidence points to him. If I don't make an arrest... I'll be relieved of this case," he gestured to his men. "Bring Mr. Blackwood down." Geoffrey was found in his room, looking resigned rather than surprised. As the constables led him past us, he stopped before Holmes. "I didn't kill her," he said quietly. "I know how it looks. I know about the debts, the audit, all of it. But I swear on my father's grave, I did not kill Victoria." His eyes held a desperate intensity. "Someone has orchestrated this perfectly. Every piece of evidence, every suspicious circumstance, it's all been arranged to condemn me. Please, Mr. Holmes, don't let them win." "Who is them, Mr. Blackwood?" Holmes asked. "I don't know. But someone in this house, someone close to our family, has been planning this for years. Find them, before they kill again." As Geoffrey was led away to the police wagon, Holmes stood motionless, his face carved from stone. "You don't believe he did it," I said quietly. "I believe he might have. The evidence supports it. But I also believe he might be telling the truth, that someone has been extraordinarily clever about making him appear guilty." He turned to face me. "Watson, I need absolute clarity. If Geoffrey is innocent, we have perhaps 36 hours before the trail grows cold. If he's guilty, we're wasting time on false leads. How do we determine which? By finding the one piece of evidence that doesn't fit the pattern. Every crime, no matter how carefully planned, contains a flaw, an inconsistency, a loose thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire tapestry." He strode toward the ballroom. "We're going to reconstruct the murder, Watson. Not as we think it happened, but as it must have happened. Every movement, every action, every second of that toast. And somewhere in that reconstruction we'll find our answer." The morning sun streamed through the ballroom windows, illuminating the space where, just 2 days ago, a bride had celebrated what should have been the happiest day of her life. Instead, she had drunk poison from crystal, smiled at her guests and danced with her new husband, all while death spread through her veins, counting down the minutes until her heart would stop. And somewhere, a murderer watched us search for truth, wondering if we were clever enough to see past the carefully constructed lies. Chapter 7. The Method Revealed. Holmes spent the remainder of the morning transforming the ballroom into a theatre of reconstruction. He recruited servants to stand in for the wedding party, positioning them precisely according to the photographer's images. I watched as he measured distances with a tape, marked positions on the floor with chalk, and consulted his notes with obsessive attention to detail. "The photographer stood here," he announced, placing a chair to represent Mr. Cartwright's position. His camera required 3 seconds of exposure. During those 3 seconds, 6 people stood motionless, or supposedly motionless, holding crystal champagne flutes. Geoffrey Blackwood's right hand partially obscured Victoria's glass. His left hand was in his waistcoat pocket. He positioned a servant, roughly Geoffrey's height and build, in the correct location. Another, playing Victoria, stood beside him holding an empty glass. "Now then," Holmes said, producing 2 identical crystal flutes from the wedding set. We're going to attempt what I believe occurred. Pay close attention, Watson." He handed one glass to the servant playing Geoffrey, then concealed the second glass inside the man's waistcoat pocket, or attempted to. The glass protruded, obviously, creating an unnatural bulge. "Too large," Holmes muttered. "A champagne flute is nearly 8 inches tall. Even in a formal waistcoat with deep pockets it would be visible." He removed the glass, thinking. Unless... His eyes lit up. Unless the glass was not in the pocket itself, but secured inside the waistcoat somehow. A special pocket sewn internally, or a holder of some kind. He turned to me urgently. "Watson, Geoffrey's formal attire from the wedding, where is it being kept?" His valet would have taken it for cleaning. "Find it, immediately." "I want every garment he wore during the ceremony, particularly the waistcoat." While I went in search of the valet, Holmes continued his reconstruction. I returned 20 minutes later with the formal wear. Morning coat, waistcoat, trousers and dress shirt, all carefully pressed and stored. Holmes seized the waistcoat with barely contained excitement. He examined it minutely, inside and out, paying particular attention to the pocket area. His fingers probed the lining, feeling for irregularities. "Here," he breathed. "Watson, see this." He turned the waistcoat inside out. The left inner pocket showed signs of alteration, careful stitching that had created a reinforced channel along the pocket's interior side, approximately 8 inches deep and 2 inches wide. "A concealed holder," I said, understanding dawning. "Designed to hold a champagne flute vertically without creating an obvious bulge." "Precisely. The glass would be held against the body, secured by this channel. From the front, with the waistcoat buttoned, it would be invisible." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "This is not improvised, Watson. This was planned, measured, constructed specifically for this purpose. The work of a tailor, or someone with sufficient sewing skill and time to practice. Note the quality of the stitching. Professional or near professional." He examined the pocket opening. "And see here. The pocket edge shows wear consistent with repeated insertion and removal of a smooth object. The glass, I'd wager. So someone practiced this. Extensively. Yeah, one doesn't perform sleight of hand before 200 witnesses without rehearsal." Holmes reached for the formal gloves that had been folded carefully beside the waistcoat. White kid leather, appropriate for a morning wedding, with pearl buttons at the wrists. He examined the right glove with his lens, and his expression sharpened. "Watson, look at the fingertips." I took the glove and immediately noticed the anomaly. The first 3 fingers of the right hand had been reinforced with an additional layer of leather on the interior, so subtle it was nearly invisible from the outside. But when I felt the fingertips, the reinforcement was unmistakable. To protect against what? I wondered aloud. Not protection, precision. Holmes demonstrated with his own hand. When handling delicate crystal while performing a switch, one needs both security and sensitivity. Too much padding and you can't feel the glass properly. Too little and the glass might slip. This reinforcement provides exactly the right balance. He turned the glove over in his hands. And there. See the faint scratching along the fingertips. Crystal against leather repeated many times. These gloves have been used to handle champagne flutes extensively. "Geoffrey's gloves," I said. "This is damning evidence." "Is it?" Holmes's tone was thoughtful. "Or is it simply more evidence in a carefully prepared trail? Let me show you something." He retrieved the 2 crystal flutes and positioned the servant again. This time, with the modified waistcoat, Holmes demonstrated how the switch might have been performed. "The poisoned glass is concealed here," he indicated the interior pocket. "See, both hands raise in the toast formation. The right hand holds the legitimate glass raised high, partially blocking the view of Victoria's glass beside it. During the 3-second exposure, the left hand moves, slowly, smoothly, extracting the poisoned glass from the waistcoat." He demonstrated the motion with painful slowness. The servant's left hand moved to the waistcoat, retrieved the concealed glass, and, in one fluid movement, switched it with the glass the Victoria servant was holding, placing the unpoisoned glass back into the waistcoat. The entire exchange takes perhaps 2 seconds if practiced. The right hand blocks direct visual observation. The photographer's camera captures only slight movement. The blur, Mr. Cartwright noted. To the wedding guests watching, nothing appears amiss. Everyone is focused on the ceremony, and on smiling for the photograph on the moment itself. "It's brilliant," I admitted. "Audacious, but possible. More than possible, proven possible by the modified clothing." Holmes set down the gloves carefully. "But here's what troubles me, Watson. This level of preparation suggests weeks, perhaps months of planning. Yet Geoffrey Blackwood didn't know the audit was scheduled until 6 weeks ago. According to Whitfield, the initial audit letter was sent in mid-October. Perhaps the audit merely accelerated an existing plan? Perhaps. But consider the timeline. The magistrate dies 5 years ago under suspicious circumstances, having prepared these poison vials and hidden them in his desk. His will creates a trust specifically to prevent Geoffrey from accessing Victoria's inheritance. 5 years pass. Then, 6 weeks before Victoria's wedding, an audit is scheduled. Geoffrey begins postponing it. Within that same 6-week period, someone cuts fresh wolfsbane from the garden, modifies formal wear with internal pockets and reinforced gloves, practices the glass switch technique extensively, and plans the murder down to the second. He began pacing. 6 weeks, Watson. Is that sufficient time for such elaborate preparation? It seems tight. Precisely. Which raises the question. Was this planned over 6 weeks in response to the audit threat, or was it planned over much longer, with the audit simply providing the final motive for execution? The latter suggests premeditation going back months or years. Yes, and if that's the case, we must ask why. Why plan to murder Victoria so far in advance? What changed that made now the perfect time? He stopped pacing abruptly. Her age. Watson, how old was Victoria? 28. 2 years from her 30th birthday, when the trust would transfer automatically regardless of marriage. Whoever planned this had a 2-year window before they lost their opportunity entirely. His eyes narrowed. But the wedding created an even better opportunity. The trust would transfer immediately upon marriage, but if she died before the legal filing, within 48 hours, the transfer wouldn't occur. It's perfect timing. So you're suggesting someone has been planning this for years, waiting for the ideal moment? I'm suggesting it's possible, but whether that someone is Geoffrey or another party... He trailed off, frustrated. A servant appeared at the ballroom door. Mr. Holmes, sir. There's a gentleman here. Says he must speak with you urgently. A Mr. William Stubbs from London. Holmes's eyebrows rose. Show him in. The man who entered was rough-hewn and dangerous-looking, with the bearing of someone accustomed to violence. He wore clothes that attempted respectability but fell short, and his hands bore the scars of a hard life. Yet he removed his cap respectfully and addressed Holmes with a certain deference. Mr. Sherlock Holmes? I'm Billy Stubbs. I run errands for Mick Halloran's establishment in Whitechapel. The gambling house, Holmes said flatly. Among other enterprises, yes, sir. I heard you was investigating the Blackwood murder. Thought you might want to know about his debts. I'm listening. Stubbs produced a worn ledger from his coat. Sir Geoffrey Blackwood. We called him the magistrate's son. He's been coming to Mick's for near on 2 years. Started small, gentlemen's games, nothing serious. But then he got the fever, if you know what I mean. Started betting heavy on horses, cards, anything with odds. He opened the ledger, showing pages of entries in cramped handwriting. This here's his account. Last entry shows £12,400 owed, plus interest, which Mick's not particular kind about. The letter threatening violence, I asked. That'd be from Mick himself. He don't like being kept waiting. Stubbs shifted uncomfortably. Thing is, Mr. Holmes, I've seen plenty of desperate men. They do stupid things when they're cornered, but Blackwood didn't strike me as the murdering type. No? No, sir. He was cocky at first. Thought his breeding made him better than us, but as the debts piled up, he got scared. Real scared. Last time I seen him, maybe 3 weeks back, he was sweating bullets, promising he'd have the money right after my sister's wedding. Said it like it was gospel truth. Holmes leaned forward. Those exact words? After my sister's wedding? Yes, sir. Kept saying it, like a prayer. Just wait until after the wedding. I'll have everything then. Mick told him he'd wait until month's end, but not a day longer. That was November 30th. And Blackwood believed he'd have the money by then. Seemed certain of it. That's what struck me as odd when I heard about the murder. If he needed his sister alive to access money, why kill her? Stubbs scratched his head. Unless I'm missing something about how these trust things work. Holmes was very still. Mr. Stubbs, you may have just provided the most important testimony of this investigation. He turned to me. Watson, don't you see? Geoffrey told his creditors he'd have money after the wedding. Not if the wedding doesn't happen, or unless something prevents it. After. He was counting on Victoria marrying, on the trust transferring, on gaining access to funds. But killing her would prevent exactly that, I said slowly. Precisely. which means either Geoffrey is a complete fool who murdered the very person who could have solved his problems, or he didn't murder her, I finished. Stubbs looked between us, confused. So he's innocent? I'm not prepared to say that definitively, but this testimony suggests his stated plan contradicts the murder motive we've been assuming. Holmes stood abruptly. Mr. Stubbs, would you be willing to testify to this conversation in court if necessary? If it means getting paid what I'm owed, I'll testify to whatever's true. Admirable pragmatism. Leave your details with Dr. Watson. You may be called upon shortly. After Stubbs departed, Holmes stood at the ballroom windows, staring out at the grounds with that distant expression I'd learned meant his mind was racing through possibilities. The pieces don't fit, Watson, he said quietly. The modified waistcoat and gloves prove someone practiced this murder extensively. The financial records prove Geoffrey had desperate need of money. The testimony proves he expected to obtain that money through Victoria's marriage, not her death. These facts are contradictory, unless he lied to his creditors about his plans. Possible, but why? If he planned to murder Victoria, why tell them he'd have money after the wedding? Why not simply disappear or claim sudden inheritance from a different source? Holmes's fingers drummed against the windowsill. No, Watson. Something is wrong with our theory. Some fundamental assumption we've made is incorrect. He spun suddenly to face me. The glass switch. We've proven it's possible, that someone prepared for it, practiced it. But we've been assuming the switch occurred during the toast, when everyone was watching. What if we're wrong about when it occurred? The photograph shows Geoffrey's hand in his waistcoat during the toast. Yes, but what if that was theatre? What if the real switch happened elsewhere, at a different time, and the hand in waistcoat was merely meant to be noticed to create a false narrative? My head was spinning. Holmes, you're constructing increasingly elaborate alternatives to the obvious solution. Because the obvious solution contains a fatal flaw. Motive! Geoffrey needed Victoria alive, not dead. Someone with the intelligence to plan this elaborate murder would recognise that simple truth. He grabbed his coat. Come, Watson, we're going to re-examine everything. The crime scene, the timeline, the witness statements. Somewhere in this mess of evidence and contradiction lies the truth. Where do we start? With the one person we haven't thoroughly questioned. The person who had intimate knowledge of the household, access to all areas of the manor, and a clear understanding of the family's secrets. His expression was grim. Mrs. Dorothea Blackwood, the aunt who inherited substantially if both siblings died. The woman who supervised all food and drink preparation. The keeper of the poison garden key. You think she killed her niece? I think we've been so focused on Geoffrey that we've overlooked other possibilities. And I think, he added darkly, that we're running out of time. If I'm right about the pattern, this murder is part of a larger plan. A plan that began 5 years ago and isn't finished yet. What do you mean, isn't finished? Holmes's face was carved from stone. Geoffrey is in custody, Watson. If he's innocent, then the real murderer is still free, still planning. And with Geoffrey arrested and out of the way, there's nothing stopping them from completing whatever scheme they began all those years ago. He strode toward the door. We have perhaps 30 hours before the trail grows cold, before legal machinery and public opinion seal Geoffrey's fate regardless of truth. Before, he stopped, before someone else dies. Come, Watson. The game is afoot, and the stakes are higher than we imagined. As we left the ballroom, I glanced back at the reconstructed toast formation. Servants standing frozen in position, crystal glasses raised, marking the exact moment when death entered Victoria Blackwood's champagne. But perhaps, I thought with growing unease, that moment wasn't what we believed at all. Perhaps we'd been watching the wrong hand, focused on the wrong magic trick, while the real murder happened in plain sight, but invisible to our assumptions. And if Holmes was right, if the murderer was still free and still planning, then Victoria's death might not be the end of this tragedy. It might only be the beginning. Chapter 8. The final pieces. Mrs. Dorothea Blackwood received us in the conservatory, a glass-roofed room filled with orchids and ferns that seemed at odds with her severe demeanour. She sat ramrod straight in a wicker chair, dressed in morning black, her face an impenetrable mask. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I assume you wish to discuss my nephew's arrest. Her tone suggested she found the entire affair distasteful but unsurprising. Among other things, Holmes settled into the chair opposite her without invitation. You supervised all food and drink preparation for the wedding. You hold a key to the poisoned garden. You stand to inherit £10,000 if both Geoffrey and Victoria die without heirs. These facts make you a person of considerable interest in this investigation. Her expression didn't change. You're quite direct, Mr. Holmes. Very well. Yes, I supervised the wedding preparations, as I have supervised this household for 5 years since my brother's death. Yes, I have a key to that damned garden, though I haven't entered it in months. And yes, I inherit a portion of the estate, though £10,000 is hardly sufficient motive for murdering my niece and nephew. Isn't it? Mr. Holmes, I'm 63 years old. I have lived comfortably on my late husband's provision for 30 years. I supervised Harrison's household out of duty, not need. £10,000 would be welcome, certainly. But not worth my immortal soul. She leaned forward slightly. Besides which, I loved Victoria. She was more daughter to me than niece. I raised her when Harrison was too absorbed in his research to notice his own children. Yet you disapproved of her marriage. I disapproved of James Hartley, who's a fortune-hunting wastrel. That doesn't mean I wished her dead. Her voice softened fractionally. I hoped she would realise her error before the wedding. I even considered... She stopped. Considered what, Mrs. Blackwood? A long pause. Revealing Geoffrey's embezzlement to her. Showing her that her family was not as stable as she believed. Hoping the shock might make her postpone the wedding. Reconsider her choices. But you didn't. No, because I realised it would only hurt her more. And because... She hesitated, seeming to struggle with something. Because I wasn't certain Geoffrey was the only thief in the household. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Explain. Small things have gone missing over the past year. A silver picture frame from Harrison's study. An antique brooch that belonged to my mother. Victoria's pearl earrings, the ones Harrison gave her for her 21st birthday. At first I thought it was the servants, but after investigation... She shook her head. Geoffrey needed money. I assumed he was selling family heirlooms to cover his debts. Did you confront him? No, I should have, but I hoped if I remained silent he might find his way out of whatever hole he'd dug himself into. Her hands clenched in her lap. I see now that my silence may have enabled something far worse than petty theft. You believe Geoffrey murdered his sister. I believe my nephew is a weak man who made terrible choices and found himself trapped by them. She met Holmes's gaze directly. The evidence is overwhelming, is it not? The gambling, the embezzlement, the audit, the poison he prepared from his father's laboratory. What else am I to think? That perhaps someone wanted you to think exactly that, Holmes said quietly. Mrs. Blackwood's composure cracked for the first time. You believe he might be innocent? I believe the evidence is almost too perfect, too convenient, every piece pointing in exactly one direction. He leaned forward. Tell me about your brother's death 5 years ago. You said his interest in poisons became an obsession. It consumed him. Those final months he barely slept, spent every waking hour in that laboratory, conducting experiments, documenting procedures. He became paranoid, convinced someone in the household wished him harm. Did he say who? He wouldn't tell me. Said he had no proof, only suspicions. But he amended his will, created that damned trust, and prepared those poison vials, his insurance he called them. Evidence if anything happened to him. She pressed her hand to her temple. 3 weeks later he collapsed at dinner. Heart failure, the doctor said. He died within the hour. Dr. Pemberton attended him. Yes, Pemberton had been Harrison's friend and colleague for years. He diagnosed acute cardiac arrest, sudden but not unexpected given Harrison's age and stress levels. Was an autopsy performed? No, the symptoms were clear. And Pemberton saw no reason for one. Harrison was buried within the week. She paused. You think he was poisoned, don't you? Murdered with his own aconitine. The thought has occurred to me. A magistrate who specialised in poisoning cases, who prepared evidence of lethal substances and warned they must be destroyed upon his death, who believed someone threatened him, and then died suddenly of heart failure, which is also a symptom of aconitine poisoning. Holmes's expression was grave. It's suggestive at minimum. But if Harrison was murdered 5 years ago and now Victoria... Mrs. Blackwood's face paled. Dear God, you think someone has been planning this all along? I think it's possible. The question is who and why. Before she could respond, Lestrade entered the conservatory, followed by the elderly gardener, old Thomas. The inspector looked uncomfortable. Mr. Holmes, I apologise for the interruption, but Mr. Wickham has information that I believe you'll want to hear immediately. Holmes gestured for the gardener to speak. The old man twisted his cap in gnarled hands. I didn't want to say nothing before, on account of Mr. Geoffrey being master here and me not wishing to speak against him. But seeing as how he's been arrested and all, he took a breath. I seen him, sir, at the poison garden, late at night, maybe 3 weeks back. You're certain it was Geoffrey? Yes, sir. I couldn't sleep that night, the arthritis, you understand. So I was sitting at my cottage window looking out at the grounds. Must have been near midnight when I seen a figure with a lantern going toward the poison garden. Recognised Mr. Geoffrey's walk right away. Had his father's same stride, he does. Did you see what he did there? Went inside the garden, was there maybe 20 minutes? When he came out, he was carrying something wrapped in cloth. Couldn't see what it was, but it was about the size of... He demonstrated with his hands. Like a bunch of flowers, maybe. Or a bunch of wolfsbane stalks, Holmes said. Yes, sir, that's what I figured. But I told myself he was doing it for proper reasons, cataloguing his father's work like he said. Didn't seem my place to question the master. Old Thomas looked miserable. Should have spoken up sooner. Might have prevented all this. After the gardener departed, Holmes stood at the conservatory windows, his back to us, perfectly still. The net tightens, Lestrade said with grim satisfaction. We have him at the garden harvesting the poison. Yeah, we have the modified clothes. We have motive, means, and opportunity. Mr. Holmes, I think we can consider this case closed. Can we? Holmes turned slowly. Mrs. Blackwood, your nephew's club membership. Does he belong to anywhere that would require formal wear regularly? The Atherton Club in London. Formal dress is required for dinner service, which Geoffrey attended perhaps twice weekly. So he would have had legitimate reason to own formal wear with no unusual circumstances in acquiring it. I suppose so. Yes. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally he spoke to Lestrade. I need to see Geoffrey, at the police station, immediately. To what purpose? He's already denied everything. Because I want to observe how he responds to specific questions, and because... Holmes paused. Because I need to understand something about his character that will determine whether he's a murderer or simply a fool. The police station holding cell was a grim place, cold and damp despite the small fire struggling in the grate. Geoffrey Blackwood sat on the narrow bed, looking far older than his 35 years. When we entered, he stood immediately, hope flashing across his face. Mr. Holmes, have you found proof of my innocence? I found many things, Mr. Blackwood. Whether they prove innocence or guilt remains to be seen. Holmes settled onto the single chair, studying Geoffrey with that penetrating gaze. I want you to tell me about your father's death. Geoffrey blinked, clearly not expecting this line of questioning. My father? What does that have to do with everything, possibly? Tell me about his final days. Geoffrey sank back onto the bed, memories clouding his expression. Father was different those last months. Paranoid, withdrawn. He spent all his time in the laboratory, barely spoke to us. Victoria tried to reach him, but he'd just mutter about his research and send her away. Did he confide his fears to you? No. I tried to speak with him once, asked what was troubling him. He looked at me with these haunted eyes and said, I've been a fool, Geoffrey. I thought I understood the nature of evil, documented it in my courtroom. But evil in one's own home, that's different. That's invisible until it's too late. Geoffrey's voice wavered. 3 weeks later he was dead. Did you suspect poison? No. Why would I? Dr. Pemberton said it was his heart. Father was under tremendous stress, working too hard. It seemed plausible. And the poison vials in his desk. You knew about them. Geoffrey hesitated, then nodded slowly. I found them perhaps a year after his death, when I was going through his papers. I didn't understand why he'd prepared them, but I assumed it was for his research. I left them there. It seemed wrong to disturb his work. Yet you took one, possibly two, and used the aconitine to murder your sister. I did not. Geoffrey's vehemence was startling. Mr. Holmes, I swear on everything I hold sacred. I did not take those vials. I didn't cut the wolfsbane. I didn't prepare poison in the laboratory. Yes, I worked there 2 months ago, cataloguing Father's notes, but I haven't been back since. Old Thomas saw you at the poison garden 3 weeks ago. Then he's mistaken, or lying. I wasn't there. He recognised your walk, your bearing. He was quite certain. Geoffrey's face showed genuine confusion. I don't understand. Thomas has known me since childhood. Why would he lie? Unless... He stopped, a new thought occurring. Unless he saw someone who walks like me, someone who wanted to be mistaken for me. You're suggesting someone impersonated you? Why not? If everything else has been arranged to incriminate me, why not that as well? Geoffrey's desperation was palpable. The modified waistcoat and gloves, I never saw those alterations. Someone must have taken my formal wear and modified it without my knowledge. The poison preparation, the wolfsbane cutting, all done to create a trail leading to me. Holmes was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. Mr. Blackwood, you owed £12,000 to dangerous men. Oh, your debt came due last week. You told your creditors you'd have money after the wedding. How did you plan to obtain that money if not through your sister's death? Geoffrey's face twisted with shame. I was going to confess everything to Victoria. After the wedding, once she was married and happy, I planned to tell her about the embezzlement, the debts, all of it. Throw myself on her mercy and beg her help. I knew she'd be furious, that I'd lose her trust, possibly face prosecution. But I also knew Victoria was kind. She wouldn't let me be killed by criminals or starve in debtor's prison. She'd find a way to help me. And you believed this would work? It was my only option that didn't involve murdering my own sister. He looked at Holmes with raw honesty. I'm a weak man, Mr. Holmes, a gambler, an embezzler, a failure as a guardian. But I'm not a murderer. I wouldn't kill Victoria. She was all I had left of our family. Holmes studied him for a long moment. Finally he stood. One final question, Mr. Blackwood. The magistrate's letter warning that someone in the household bore him ill will. Do you have any suspicions about who he meant? I've thought about it constantly since you showed me that letter. The only people who lived in the household then were myself, Victoria, Aunt Dorothea, and the servants, most of whom have been with us for decades. He shook his head helplessly. I can't imagine any of them wishing father harm. Could your father have suspected you? The question hung in the air like a knife. Geoffrey's face went white. Is that what you think? That father suspected me? That he was trying to protect Victoria from me? His voice broke. Sarsi, God help me. If that's true, if father died thinking I was a threat to our family. I'm merely exploring possibilities, Holmes said, but his tone was thoughtful rather than accusatory. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You've been most illuminating. As we left the police station, I turned to Holmes with frustration. Well? Is he guilty or innocent? He's certainly guilty of being a weak, self-destructive fool, Holmes replied. But murder? He shook his head slowly. Watson, I've interviewed hundreds of criminals in my career. I've learned to distinguish genuine emotion from performance. Geoffrey Blackwood is either innocent or the finest actor I've ever encountered. But the evidence is overwhelming. Too overwhelming. Every piece fits too perfectly. He stopped on the station steps, looking out at the grey Surrey afternoon. Consider, Watson. If you were planning to murder your sister and frame yourself, what would you do differently than what has occurred? I wouldn't frame myself at all. Precisely. Yet that's exactly what appears to have happened. Geoffrey has left a trail of evidence that a child could follow, while simultaneously employing sophisticated methods, the glass switch, the delayed action poison, the careful timing, that suggest considerable intelligence. So you believe he's innocent? I believe. Holmes paused, choosing his words carefully. I believe we may have been looking at this crime backwards, assuming the complexity was in the method, when perhaps the true complexity lies in the misdirection. I don't understand. Neither do I, not completely, but I'm beginning to see the outline of something extraordinarily clever. A plan that's been in motion for 5 years, executed with patience and precision by someone who understands human nature intimately. He began walking rapidly toward our waiting carriage. Watson, we're going to conduct one final experiment. We're going to reconstruct the entire wedding day from beginning to end, accounting for every person's movements, every opportunity for poisoning. And somewhere in that reconstruction, we'll find the moment, the exact moment, when death entered Victoria Blackwood's glass. You think it wasn't during the toast? I think perhaps the toast was merely theatre, a spectacle designed to draw our attention, while the real crime occurred elsewhere, else when. His eyes gleamed with that dangerous light. Someone has been very clever, Watson, but even the cleverest criminals make mistakes, and I'm going to find that mistake no matter how small. We returned to Blackwood Manor as evening fell. Holmes immediately summoned all members of the household, family, guests who had remained, and servants, to the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I require your assistance in resolving this tragedy. We are going to reconstruct the wedding day precisely as it occurred. Every action, every movement, every moment from the ceremony's conclusion until Victoria Blackwood's death." "To what purpose?" James Hartley demanded. He looked haggard, hollow-eyed from grief and guilt. "We already know who killed her." "Do we? I wonder." Holmes gestured to the assembled company. "Humour me, Mr. Hartley. Position yourselves exactly as you stood during the wedding breakfast. Servants, bring out the champagne service as it was arranged. I want everything duplicated exactly." For the next 2 hours, Holmes orchestrated a macabre recreation. Servants brought out champagne bottles, arranged glasses on silver trays, positioned furniture as it had been. Wedding guests stood in their original locations, moving through remembered conversations and toasts. I watched Holmes prowl through the reconstruction like a hunting cat, observing, questioning, making notes. He paid particular attention to the champagne service area, questioning the butler Price extensively about every bottle opened, every glass poured. "The toast formation," Holmes directed. "Everyone in position. Mr. Hartley, you handed Victoria her glass. Show me exactly how." Hartley moved through the motions, selecting a glass from the tray, presenting it to where Victoria would have stood. I wanted it to be perfect. I examined several glasses, chose the one with the clearest crystal. And where were the other glasses? On the tray, perhaps a dozen of them, all filled and ready. Holmes examined the tray's position relative to the toast formation. His expression grew increasingly focused. "Who arranged these glasses on the tray?" "I did, sir," Price said, "with assistance from Mr. Weatherby, as I mentioned. And they sat here, accessible to anyone. For how long before the toast?" "Perhaps 15 minutes. Guests were finishing their meals, moving about. The toast was scheduled for 2 o'clock. "Accessible to anyone," Holmes murmured. He turned to the assembled company. "That means anyone present could have approached this tray, selected a specific glass, added poison, and returned it, all without raising suspicion because champagne service was expected and ongoing. But how would they ensure Victoria received that specific glass?" I asked. "They couldn't. Unless..." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Unless they didn't poison a glass on the tray at all. What if the method was entirely different? What if someone handed Victoria a poisoned glass directly, under circumstances where it seemed natural and unsuspicious?" He spun to face James Hartley. "You selected her glass. You examined several, chose the perfect one, handed it to her personally. How do we know that glass wasn't poisoned before you selected it?" Hartley went white. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm establishing possibilities. You needed Victoria alive to access her money, yes. But what if there was another benefit to her death? Insurance, perhaps. Or freedom to marry elsewhere." "How dare you—" "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade interrupted. "We've established the glass was switched during the toast. The photograph proves it." "Does it?" Holmes retrieved the photograph, studying it intently. "Or does it prove that Geoffrey Blackwood's hand was in his waistcoat during the toast? Those are not the same thing." He fell silent, staring at the photograph with such intensity I thought he might burn a hole through it. The ballroom was utterly quiet, everyone watching Holmes with varying degrees of confusion, fear, or anticipation. Finally he looked up. His face was transformed, the uncertainty and doubt replaced by absolute certainty. "I've been a fool," he said quietly, blinded by complexity when the truth was simple. Misdirected by elaborate staging when the real crime was straightforward. He looked around at the assembled faces, and I know exactly how Victoria Blackwood was murdered, and by whom. "Who?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes's smile was cold as winter. "Patience, Inspector. First I need to verify one final detail. Then tomorrow morning I will gather everyone involved and reveal the complete truth, how the crime was committed, why it was committed, and most importantly, who committed it." "Why wait?" Hartley asked. "Because the criminal in question deserves one final night of freedom, one last night to contemplate their crime and decide whether to confess before I expose them." Holmes's voice was hard as iron, "and because I want them to spend that night knowing I've solved their clever puzzle, that all their elaborate planning has come to nothing, that justice is inevitable." He turned to Lestrade. "Have Geoffrey Blackwood brought back to the manor under guard. He'll need to be present for the revelation. And Inspector, have your men ready." When I name the murderer, they may attempt to flee or worse. As the gathering dispersed in confused murmurs, I pulled Holmes aside. You know who killed Victoria? I do now. The answer was in the photograph all along, but I was looking at the wrong part of it. He showed me the image again, pointing to a detail I'd overlooked. See here, Watson, the evidence that solves everything. I looked where he indicated, and slowly the pieces began to fall into place. Good Lord, I breathed. It was so obvious. The best deceptions always are, once you see them. You wonder how you ever missed the truth. Holmes's expression was grim. Our murderer is extraordinarily intelligent, Watson. They've played a game of chess with human lives, thinking 5 moves ahead. But they made one small error, an error visible in 3 seconds of photographic exposure. What happens now? Now, Holmes said softly, we prepare for the endgame. Tomorrow morning, the truth will be revealed, justice will be served, and Victoria Blackwood's murderer will face the consequences of their cleverness. He looked out at the darkening grounds where somewhere a killer waited, wondering if Sherlock Holmes had truly solved the unsolvable crime. The answer, they would learn at dawn, was yes. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. 3 weeks after Geoffrey Blackwood's arrest, there's a straw. I sat in our Baker Street lodgings watching the November rain streak the windows. Holmes occupied his usual chair, violin resting silent across his lap, his gaze distant and melancholic. We had just returned from the Old Bailey, where Geoffrey's trial had concluded with grim inevitability. Guilty on all counts, I said, though Holmes already knew. He'd attended every day of the proceedings, watching with that peculiar intensity as the prosecution systematically dismantled any remaining doubt about Geoffrey Blackwood's guilt. 3 days of testimony to confirm what we already knew. Holmes's voice was flat. The modified waistcoat and gloves were presented to the jury, the poison vials from the magistrate's desk now proven to be the source of the aconitin, old Thomas's testimony about seeing Geoffrey at the poison garden, the financial records showing £12,000 of debt, Whitfield's testimony about the postponed audit, the photographer's evidence of Geoffrey's suspicious hand position, and of course, Geoffrey's own confession, read aloud in his absence. His absence? He refused to attend the final day, couldn't bear to hear himself condemned in his own words, I suppose. Holmes set down the violin with unusual care. The jury deliberated less than an hour. The judge will pass sentence tomorrow, but the outcome is certain. Death by hanging. He murdered his own sister, I said, trying to find some sense of justice in the verdict. Premeditated, calculated murder for financial gain. What else could the sentence be? Nothing else. The law is clear, the crime is heinous. And society demands blood for blood. Holmes rose and moved to the window. Yet I find myself troubled, Watson. Not by the verdict, which is just, but by the waste of it all. 2 lives destroyed, Victoria's ended, Geoffrey's ruined. And for what? Gambling debts that might have been negotiated, embezzlement that might have been repaid, an audit that might have been survived with honesty and contrition. Geoffrey chose his path. Did he? Or was he driven to it by weakness so profound he had no real choice? Holmes turned from the window, his expression troubled. I keep thinking about what he said. That part of him wanted to be caught. That he left evidence everywhere because some remnant of decency was crying out to be stopped. If that's true, then his was a soul at war with itself, with the monster winning only narrowly over the man. That doesn't excuse murder. No, it doesn't. But it makes it more tragic somehow. A strong man choosing evil is one thing. A weak man succumbing to it is another. He paused. I've been considering Geoffrey's question to me during one of our interviews. He asked whether I thought his father had suspected him, whether Harrison Blackwood had created the trust and prepared those poison vials as protection against his own son. Do you think he did? I've read Harrison Blackwood's journals extensively these past weeks. He was a man consumed by the study of evil. He'd seen it in his courtroom, documented it in his cases, analysed it from every angle, and then he came to suspect it in his own household. Holmes moved to his desk, retrieving a leather-bound journal. Listen to this. Written 6 months before his death. I have studied evil for 30 years, believing I understood its nature. But I was wrong. Evil is not the dramatic villainy I saw in my courtroom. It is quieter, more insidious. It is weakness given opportunity. It is small compromises that compound into catastrophe. It is loving someone while suspecting they may destroy you. I fear I have been blind to what grows in my own garden. But without proof, what can I do? Accuse my own blood? Destroy my family on suspicion alone? I can only prepare, hope I am wrong, and pray that love proves stronger than weakness. Holmes closed the journal. He suspected Geoffrey, not of murder, not yet, but of the weaknesses that might lead there. The gambling, the irresponsibility, the inability to face consequences. So he created the trust to protect Victoria. I prepared the poison vials as evidence if anything happened to him, and hoped his son would prove him wrong. But Geoffrey proved him right. 5 years later, yes, using the very poison his father prepared as a warning. Holmes's voice was heavy with irony. Harrison Blackwood created the instrument of his daughter's death while trying to protect her. If he could see what his insurance was used for, I imagine he'd wish he'd destroyed those vials after all. I had no response to that. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, matching my sombre mood. "What will happen to the others?" I asked finally. "James Hartley, Mrs. Blackwood, the rest?" Holmes consulted notes on his desk. "Hartley has returned to London to settle his business affairs. His shipping company is being liquidated. He'll have nothing. Bankruptcy and a brief tragic marriage his only legacies. I understand he's considering emigration to America, starting fresh where no one knows his history." "And Mrs. Blackwood?" "She remains at the manor, though I suspect not for long. The house holds too many painful memories. She's making arrangements to sell the estate. Geoffrey's creditors have legal claims against it now, and the scandal has made it unmarketable anyway. She'll take her £10,000 bequest and retire to Bath, I believe. Live out her remaining years in quiet disgrace, another victim of Geoffrey's crime. What about Victoria's portion of the estate?" Fascinating question, actually. Since she died before the trust transferred, her inheritance remains in legal limbo. The court will likely assign it to charitable causes as specified in the magistrate's original will. Geoffrey's creditors are fighting for access, but the law is clear. A murderer cannot profit from his crime, directly or indirectly. Whatever money remains after legal fees will go to orphanages and hospitals. At least some good may come from this tragedy. Holmes retrieved a newspaper from his desk. "I've been following the press coverage. The scandal has been tremendous. Magistrate's son murders sister at wedding. Gambling debts lead to fratricide. Society wedding ends in poisoned death." The details have been sensationalized beyond recognition. Geoffrey is portrayed as a monster of depravity, Victoria as an innocent angel, and the truth, more complex and sadder than either characterization, is lost in the melodrama. "Will you allow me to publish the true account?" I asked. "For your chronicles?" Holmes considered this. "Eventually, perhaps. When enough time has passed that the principles are dead and the pain has faded. But not yet, Watson. This case feels too raw, too recent. The wounds are still open." He paused. "And truthfully, I'm not certain I want this case remembered. It represents no great triumph of deduction, no impossible puzzle brilliantly solved. It's merely a sad story of human weakness leading to tragedy. Nothing more. You solved an elaborate murder before 200 witnesses. That's worthy of a record. Did I? Or did I merely observe what Geoffrey Blackwood essentially showed me? He left evidence everywhere, Watson. The modified clothing practically announced his method. The gambling debts spelled out his motive. The confession sealed his fate. I was less detective than witness to a man's self-destruction." Holmes's voice was bitter. "Some cases test one's abilities. This one tested nothing except my capacity for sadness at human nature." A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, Dr. Pemberton, the family physician from Blackwood Manor. The doctor entered looking haggard and aged beyond his years. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. Forgive the intrusion, but I had to speak with you before returning to Surrey." "Of course, doctor. Please sit." Holmes gestured to a chair. "You've come from the trial?" "Yes, I attended as a witness, though my testimony was largely unnecessary given Geoffrey's confession." Pemberton settled into the chair with the weariness of one carrying a heavy burden. "But that's not why I've come. I've come to confess something that's been troubling me since Victoria's death." Holmes's interest sharpened. "Indeed." "Harrison Blackwood's death 5 years ago. You questioned whether it was natural, and I assured you it was. Heart failure. Sudden but not unexpected given his condition." Pemberton's hands trembled slightly. "That was the truth as I understood it at the time. But I've been reviewing my notes, remembering the symptoms, and I'm no longer certain. Explain. Harrison's final illness lasted approximately 2 hours. He complained of numbness in his extremities, difficulty breathing, irregular heartbeat. I attributed these to cardiac distress, but knowing now what aconitine poisoning looks like, having seen Victoria's death, he paused. The symptoms are virtually identical. I think Harrison Blackwood may have been murdered with the very poison he had prepared. The implications settled over the room like a shroud. But Geoffrey claims he had nothing to do with his father's death, I protested. He admitted to murdering Victoria but denied patricide. I believe him, Pemberton said. Geoffrey was 29 when his father died, already showing signs of irresponsibility but not yet desperate. He had no motive to kill Harrison at that time. The magistrate's death actually made his life more difficult, saddling him with responsibilities he wasn't prepared for. Then who? Holmes demanded. I don't know. But I keep remembering something Harrison said to me a week before his death. We were in his study, and he showed me the poison vials he'd prepared. He said, "These are my insurance, Pemberton. If something happens to me, if I die suddenly, promise me you'll investigate. Don't accept the obvious explanation. Evil hides in plain sight behind familiar faces." I promised I would, but when he died, I was so certain it was natural causes that I never thought to investigate further. Holmes's expression was intense. You're suggesting someone in the household murdered Harrison Blackwood 5 years ago, and then murdered Victoria now? I'm suggesting it's possible. The same poison, the same method of making it appear natural, the same household. Pemberton shook his head. But I have no proof, only retrospective suspicion. And with Geoffrey's confession to Victoria's murder, who would believe that someone else was involved? Did Harrison suspect anyone specifically? He never said. But he was obsessed with the idea of evil within the family, of betrayal from someone close. I assumed it was paranoia brought on by stress. But what if he was right? What if someone murdered him, took the remaining poison vials, and waited 5 years for the perfect opportunity to use them again? Holmes stood abruptly and began pacing. If Harrison was murdered, the killer must have known about the poison vials. They were hidden in his locked desk drawer, not common knowledge. Harrison showed them to me. He may have shown them to others he trusted. Or someone discovered them after his death when the desk was cleared. Holmes's mind was racing through possibilities. Watson, who had access to Harrison's study after his death? Geoffrey, certainly. Mrs. Blackwood, Victoria, the household staff during cleaning. And Geoffrey claims he found the vials a year after his father's death. If that's true, they sat in that locked drawer for 12 months, accessible to anyone who found the key or picked the lock. Holmes stopped pacing. Dr. Pemberton, I need you to think very carefully. During Harrison's final illness, who was present? Myself, of course, Geoffrey and Victoria, who were distraught, Mrs. Blackwood, who supervised his care, several servants who brought water, medicine, cold compresses. And what did Harrison drink or eat during those final hours? Water, primarily. He couldn't keep food down. I administered laudanum for the pain, thinking it was cardiac distress. If I'd known, Pemberton's voice broke. If I'd recognised poisoning, I might have saved him. Or you might have become a target yourself, Holmes said grimly. If someone murdered Harrison, and you'd accused them, they might have silenced you as well. But why wait 5 years to kill Victoria, I asked. If the murderer had the poison and the opportunity, why not use it sooner? Because Victoria's death only became useful recently, Holmes said slowly. When her marriage approached and the trust transfer became imminent, if someone stood to benefit from preventing that transfer. He trailed off, thinking, but Geoffrey is the only one who benefited, and he's confessed. Has he? Pemberton asked quietly. Or has he confessed to a crime he believed he committed, but perhaps didn't? The thought was staggering. Well, you're suggesting Geoffrey has confessed falsely? I'm suggesting that Geoffrey prepared to commit murder, modified his clothing, cut wolfsbane, practiced the glass switch. But perhaps someone else actually executed the crime. Someone who knew about his preparations and used them to frame him perfectly. Holmes's expression was troubled. It's an interesting theory, Doctor, but the evidence against Geoffrey is overwhelming. His own confession confirms it. His confession confirms he planned to murder Victoria. But did he actually do it? Or did someone else poison her glass using a different method, knowing Geoffrey would be blamed? Pemberton stood. I have no proof, only suspicions that will haunt me. But I wanted you to know, Mr. Holmes, in case... He hesitated. In case Geoffrey is hanged for a crime he didn't quite commit. After Pemberton left, Holmes and I sat in troubled silence. What do you think? I asked finally. I think Dr. Pemberton is a good man tormented by uncertainty and guilt. He missed poisoning 5 years ago and now sees it everywhere. Holmes picked up his violin but didn't play. But I also think his questions are worth considering. Geoffrey's confession was detailed about his preparations but vaguer about the actual execution. He described planning, practicing, intending, but did he clearly state that he personally switched the glasses during the toast? I retrieved my notes from the trial. Reading through Geoffrey's confession, I realised Holmes was right. The language was ambiguous. Geoffrey had confessed to preparing the poison, modifying his clothes, planning the murder. But the actual moment of poisoning was described more as an assumption than a witnessed fact. Good Lord, I breathed. He confessed to attempting murder, and we all assumed that meant he succeeded. Or he confessed to what he believed he did, what he intended to do, what all evidence suggested he did. Holmes set down the violin with a sigh. But Watson, even if we entertain this possibility, what can we do? Geoffrey has been convicted. The evidence against him is overwhelming. His conviction would stand even if we proved someone else was also involved. But he'd be hanged for a murder he didn't commit. Would he? He prepared the poison. He modified his clothing for the purpose. He planned and practiced the murder. Even if someone else executed it, which is purely speculative, Geoffrey is still guilty of conspiracy, of attempted murder, of being an accessory. The law would hang him regardless. But the truth, Holmes interrupted sharply, is that Victoria Blackwood is dead from aconitine poisoning. The truth is that Geoffrey Blackwood planned to kill her and had the means, motive and opportunity to do so. Whether he personally administered the fatal dose or whether some hypothetical other party did becomes academic. Justice is served either way. You don't believe that? Holmes was silent for a long moment. I believe that Geoffrey Blackwood is being punished for his crimes. Planning murder, embezzlement, betrayal of family trust. Whether he's also being punished for a crime someone else committed. He shook his head. Without evidence, Watson, it's merely speculation. And speculation cannot overturn a conviction. But if Harrison was murdered, if there's another killer, if Harrison was murdered, the killer has gotten away with it for 5 years and likely will continue to do so. Without new evidence, without proof beyond Dr. Pemberton's retrospective suspicions, there's nothing to investigate. Holmes's voice was heavy with frustration. I hate it as much as you do, Watson. The possibility that we've missed something, that justice is imperfect, that the truth is more complex than the verdict suggests. But I see no path forward. We sat in gloomy silence as the rain continued. Finally Holmes spoke again, more quietly. Do you know what Geoffrey said to me during our last interview? He asked me to look after his aunt, to ensure Mrs. Blackwood was treated fairly by the courts and the creditors. And he asked me to tell Victoria's story truthfully, not the sensationalised version in the newspapers, but the real story of a young woman who deserved better than the family she was born into. What did you tell him? I said I would do what I could, though I'm not certain I can fulfil either promise. Holmes moved to his desk, retrieving a letter. This arrived this morning, from Geoffrey, written in his cell. He asked me not to pursue any alternative theories about his father's death or Victoria's murder. He says, and I quote, "I am guilty of enough, Mr. Holmes. If there are other crimes, other criminals, let them remain hidden. I cannot bear to have my family's disgrace compounded further. Let me hang for what I did and what I intended. And let the matter rest." He's protecting someone. Or he's simply exhausted by guilt and shame and wants the ordeal to end. Holmes set down the letter. Either way, I'm bound by his wishes. Geoffrey Blackwood has asked me to let the case remain closed, and I will respect that request. Even if it means an injustice. Even then. Sometimes, Watson, the pursuit of perfect truth causes more harm than accepting imperfect justice. Geoffrey will hang for his crimes, real and intended. If there are others who share his guilt, they will carry that burden in silence. It's not ideal, but it's what Geoffrey has chosen. I had no response to that. The rain had intensified, drumming against the windows like accusatory fingers. The execution was carried out on a grey December morning. Holmes and I did not attend. There are some grim spectacles better left unwatched. But the newspapers reported it in detail. Geoffrey Blackwood went to the gallows with dignity, refused a final statement, and died without resistance at precisely 8 o'clock. Mrs. Dorothea Blackwood attended, witness to the end of her family line. She sold Blackwood Manor within the month and retired to Bath as Holmes had predicted. She died 2 years later, leaving her £10,000 to various charities. She never spoke publicly about the tragedy again. James Hartley did indeed emigrate to America. I heard years later that he remarried and rebuilt his business, finding some measure of peace in a new life far from the memories of his first tragic wedding. The others dispersed into their own lives, carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed. The case became a cautionary tale in legal circles, studied for its forensic evidence and psychological complexity. And Holmes never spoke of it again unless pressed. When I mentioned writing up the case years later, he discouraged it. "Let it remain private, Watson. The world has enough sordid tales of family tragedy. This one need not be added to the collection." But I wrote it down anyway, for my own records, adding this final note: "Thus concluded the case I have called Murder on a Wedding Day. It stands in my chronicles not as a triumph of deduction, for the solution was apparent once the evidence was assembled, but as a meditation on human weakness, the corrosive power of desperation, and the terrible consequences of small moral compromises compounded over time. Geoffrey Blackwood was not a monster born, but a monster made, by his own weaknesses certainly, but also by circumstances, by gambling addiction, by financial pressure, by the absence of strong moral guidance. He made terrible choices, culminating in the worst choice of all. And he paid the ultimate price. But I cannot shake Dr. Pemberton's questions, nor Holmes's troubling silence on the matter. Was Geoffrey truly alone in his guilt? Or did he hang for crimes shared with another who remained free? We will never know. Holmes refused to investigate further, bound by Geoffrey's final request. Perhaps that is for the best. Some truths, once uncovered, cannot be borne. Some stones are better left unturned. Victoria Blackwood lies in the family crypt, her gravestone reading, "Beloved daughter and sister. Taken too soon." The irony of that final word is cruel. She was indeed beloved by the brother who killed her in his twisted way. And somewhere, perhaps, Harrison Blackwood's spirit watches, wondering if his paranoia was justified, if his preparations were used not to expose evil, but to enable it, if his attempts to protect his daughter instead gave her murderer the means of her death. It is a case without triumph, a solution without satisfaction, justice without peace. It haunts me still, and I suspect it haunts Holmes more than he will admit. For in solving this murder, we answered how and why and when, but perhaps we never truly answered who. Not completely, not with the certainty justice demands. And that, I fear, is the real tragedy of Blackwood Manor. I closed my journal as the December twilight settled over Baker Street. Holmes sat across from me, smoking his pipe, lost in thought. The fire crackled softly, and outside London pursued its endless business, indifferent to tragedies past and present. "Do you ever wonder," I asked quietly, "if we got it right?" Holmes was silent for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke. "Every day, Watson. Every day." And with that, the case of Victoria Blackwood's murder was truly, finally closed.